There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a battlefield the night before everything changes. Not peace, not calm, something heavier than both. A held breath stretched across miles of earth, where men lie awake staring at a sky that doesn't yet know what morning will ask of it. It is the summer of 1943. Somewhere in the southern Soviet Union, in the long grass and shallow trenches of a front line that has been moving, shifting, bleeding for 2 full years, soldiers are waiting. Some of them are writing letters they may never send. Some are cleaning weapons that are already clean. Some are simply still, listening to the faint mechanical groan of armored vehicles repositioning in the dark, the distant rumble of artillery that never fully stops on the Eastern Front, the sound of a war that has swallowed millions and is still hungry. Among those soldiers are the men of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, Hitler's own, the Black Corps, the unit that began as a personal protection detail and grew into something the German war machine held up as proof of its own invincibility. They had fought in Poland. They had driven through France. They had pressed deep into the Soviet Union in the fever summer of 1941, advancing so fast that maps became obsolete before the ink dried. They had survived the frozen catastrophe outside Moscow. They had clawed back Kharkov in the spring, the last clean German victory the East would offer, and now they were here, at Kursk, at the edge of an operation their own commanders privately doubted, inside a plan that had been argued over, delayed, revised, and delayed again, while the enemy spent every borrowed week digging, laying wire, burying mines, and waiting. What follows is not a story of glory. It is something more durable than that. It is the story of what happens when an elite force, trained to the edge of human capability, ideologically hardened, and battle-proven across half a continent, runs directly into the wall of what history has already decided. It is the story of men who were told they were exceptional, and who in many ways were, discovering that exceptional is not the same as unstoppable. This is the complete history of the Leibstandarte at Kursk, from the men who built it and the ideology that shaped it, through the campaigns that forged it into a weapon, to the summer battle that revealed the limits of everything Germany believed about itself and its army. We will follow this division from its earliest formation through the grinding attritional warfare of July 1943, through the retreat that never fully ended, and into the long unraveling that followed. 18 chapters, one continuous arc, the rise, the breaking point, and what came after. And here is what makes this story worth your time on a quiet night. The Leibstandarte is not interesting because it was powerful. Plenty of units were powerful. It is interesting because of what it represented, and because of what happened when that representation met reality. Germany poured its finest resources into these men, the best equipment, the most intensive training, the most modern armor, and sent them into a battle the Soviet Union had spent months preparing to absorb. The collision tells you something true about the limits of elite military force in the face of industrial scale and strategic depth. It tells you something about the difference between winning battles and winning wars. And it tells you something about what ideology does to an institution when it replaces honest assessment with belief in its own mythology. We will not look away from the harder truths here. The Leibstandarte was an SS formation, built on racial ideology, bound to a regime responsible for systematic atrocity. That context does not disappear when we examine their battlefield performance. It defines the frame inside which every tactical story sits. These men were skilled, they were brave in the narrow, physical sense of the word, and they served a cause that history has judged without ambiguity. Holding both of those things at once, the military reality and the moral weight, is what honest history requires. But tonight, as you settle in, what we offer you is something different from a textbook and different from a highlight reel. This is a long, slow, careful walk through one of the most consequential military engagements of the 20th century, told with the pacing that the story deserves and the detail that makes it real. The names of commanders, the layout of the defenses, the internal arguments that shaped German planning, the Soviet engineering that turned the Kursk salient into a killing ground of extraordinary depth, the day-by-day grinding reality of a battle that was supposed to be decisive and instead became something else entirely. The moment the Eastern Front shifted permanently and the long road home, for the Leibstandarte, for the Wehrmacht, for Germany, began in earnest. If you are new here, welcome. This channel exists for exactly these kinds of nights, when you want something to listen to that is worth listening to, that carries weight and intelligence and doesn't rush past the details that matter. The story of Kursk is one of the most documented, most studied, and most debated engagements in military history, and we have worked to give it the treatment it deserves. If this is the kind of history you want more of, then settle in, hit subscribe, and let the night carry you through it. And if you are returning, if you have spent other nights on this channel moving through Stalingrad, or North Africa, or the Pacific campaigns, then you already know what kind of company you are in. Turn the lights low, find a comfortable position, let the story begin. Because out there in the dark of July 1943, the silence is about to end. Artillery will open across a front, stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Thousands of armored vehicles will move at first light. The Leibstandarte will advance into defensive belts that no German intelligence report has correctly measured, against a Soviet military that has spent 2 years learning from every mistake and building something Germany is not prepared for. The men in those trenches do not know exactly what is coming. Some of them sense it. A veteran's instinct, sharpened by 2 years of Eastern Front fighting, is a hard thing to deceive. But orders are orders, and the order is to advance, and so they will advance. This is where we begin. Before the battles, before the blood-soaked fields of the Eastern Front, before the grinding horror of Kursk, there was a small room, a nervous political movement, and a handful of men chosen to stand close to one man. That is where this story begins. Not on a battlefield, not in a ministry of war, but in the volatile street politics of early 1920s Munich, where a rising agitator named Adolf Hitler required people he could trust absolutely. The unit that would one day tear through the defensive belts of the Kursk salient, that would become synonymous with both ruthless efficiency and ideological fanaticism, started as something almost modest, a personal protection detail, a ring of bodies between one man and the chaos surrounding him. History rarely announces its most consequential beginnings with fanfare. This one began in cigarette smoke and beer hall tension. In the early years of the National Socialist movement, physical security was a genuine and pressing concern. Political violence in the Weimar Republic was not occasional, it was structural, woven into the fabric of a broken society struggling to absorb military defeat, economic collapse, and revolutionary pressure from every direction. Street meetings turned into brawls. Rallies ended in bloodshed. The various factions of German political life fought each other with fists, clubs, and occasionally firearms across the cities of Bavaria and beyond. Within this environment, Hitler's Sturmabteilung, the SA, the brown-shirted paramilitary arm of the movement, provided general crowd muscle. But Hitler wanted something different for his own protection, something drawn tighter, answerable only to him, loyal in a way that transcended organizational politics. the idea of a small, personally selected bodyguard unit began to take shape around 1923, and from that impulse, the seed of the Leibstandarte was planted. The name itself came later. In those earliest years, the unit went through several organizational incarnations, gradually formalizing into what would eventually carry the full designation Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, a title that translates roughly as the Lifeguard Regiment Adolf Hitler, invoking the tradition of royal household troops protecting a sovereign. That invocation was entirely deliberate. Hitler understood theatre, understood the symbolic weight of names and uniforms and ceremony. To give his personal guard a name drawn from the vocabulary of royal protection was to position himself and his movement within a tradition of legitimate power, even while the movement was still clawing toward it. The unit was intended to project inevitability, authority, and personal devotion all at once. In the early years, it projected mostly ambition. The 1923 Beer Hall Putsch, Hitler's failed attempt to seize power in Munich, temporarily derailed the entire movement and scattered its organizational structures. Hitler's subsequent imprisonment and the legal prohibition of many National Socialist organizations forced a period of rebuilding when he emerged. But rather than weakening his commitment to a personal guard, the experience of vulnerability, of political failure, of dependency on unreliable allies, deepened it. When the movement reconstituted itself through the latter half of the 1920s and into the early 1930s, the rebuilding of a tight, personally loyal security force was among its priorities. The man placed in charge of developing the broader SS organization, Heinrich Himmler, would eventually come to shape the Leibstandarte's character as profoundly as any battlefield experience. Himmler's vision for the SS was not merely security, it was biological and ideological purity made visible in human form. Recruitment standards for the Leibstandarte, particularly as the organization expanded through the early 1930s, were designed to produce something that looked as much as it fought. Height requirements were stringent. Candidates were expected to meet minimums well above the average German male, requirements that would have excluded enormous portions of the population. Racial and genealogical documentation was mandatory, with candidates required to trace their ancestry back through multiple generations to satisfy the pseudo-scientific racial criteria that Himmler and the SS hierarchy had constructed. Physical fitness standards were demanding, designed to select for exceptional specimens rather than merely adequate soldiers. Dental records were reviewed. Eye prescriptions were assessed. The process was simultaneously a military selection and an ideological performance, each recruit serving as a living argument for the racial theories the movement was built upon. The result was a unit that was, visually at least, striking. Tall, physically imposing, uniformed with a care that distinguished them sharply from ordinary military formations. But physical selection was only one half of what made the Leibstandarte what it became. The other half was ideological formation, and this process was continuous, deliberate, and thorough. New recruits entered an environment saturated with National Socialist doctrine, with a conception of loyalty that was not directed toward Germany as an abstract nation, but toward Hitler as a specific person. The oath sworn by SS members was not a conventional military oath to the state or constitution. It was a personal oath to Adolf Hitler, binding the individual to the man rather than to any institution that might outlast or constrain him. This distinction was not bureaucratic trivia. It was the foundational architecture of the unit's identity, the thing that made the Leibstandarte categorically different from Wehrmacht formations, even elite Wehrmacht formations. A soldier of the army swore allegiance to Germany. A man of the Leibstandarte swore allegiance to one person. The psychological and practical consequences of that difference would echo through everything that followed. As Germany moved through the mid-1930s and the National Socialist government consolidated power, the Leibstandarte's role expanded in ways that reflected the expanding ambitions of the regime. They appeared at major state occasions, providing ceremonial guards of honor at events that projected German power and order to domestic and international audiences. They stood at the Nuremberg rallies, human architecture arranged to make ideology legible to the eye. They were present at the annexation of Austria in 1938, moving as a military force into a country being absorbed without conventional warfare, their presence part of the coercive theatre of that moment. Each of these appearances reinforced the unit's special status, their visibility communicating to the German public and to foreign observers alike that these men were not ordinary soldiers. They were the physical embodiment of the regime's self-image. Yet within German military circles, the Leibstandarte were not universally admired. The Wehrmacht's traditional officer corps viewed them with a mixture of contempt and unease. Contempt because, in the early years especially, their military training lagged behind professional standards. Ideological fervor and physical impressiveness did not automatically translate into tactical competence. Unease because the personal loyalty they embodied to Hitler represented a structural challenge to the conventional chain of command, a parallel military hierarchy answerable to different authorities and different principles. Senior army generals in the late 1930s repeatedly raised concerns about the expansion of SS military formations, about arming and equipping units that reported not through the Wehrmacht's command structure, but through Himmler's apparatus. Those concerns were noted, registered, and ultimately ignored. The political momentum behind the SS was by then simply too great. The late 1930s brought both expansion and transformation. The Leibstandarte grew from its origins as a guard detachment into something with genuine military mass, motorized infantry, artillery, anti-tank elements, supporting arms. The men who had been selected partly for their height and racial documentation were now being trained with increasing seriousness as actual combat soldiers. Officers who had come up through the early SS ranks began receiving more substantial military education, equipment improved, organizational structures were refined. The gap between ceremonial elite and combat formation began to narrow as war moved from theoretical ambition to practical certainty. By the time German forces crossed into Poland in September 1939, the Leibstandarte was no longer purely symbolic. They were dangerous. That transition, from symbol to weapon, was neither clean nor complete by the outbreak of war. The ideological foundations that had been laid with such care in the early years did not disappear as military professionalism increased. They deepened and hardened, becoming the lens through which the Leibstandarte understood its own identity. They were not merely soldiers. They were, in their own conception and in the regime's presentation of them, the physical expression of a political idea, the proof of concept for a racial and ideological project. This self-understanding shaped not only how they fought, but what they were willing to do, the limits they recognized or refused to recognize, the orders they carried out without hesitation. The ideological formation of those early years was not incidental to what the Leibstandarte became at Kursk and beyond. It was foundational. There is a particular kind of institution that is built to be both believed and feared simultaneously, that derives its power not only from capability, but from the story told about that capability. The Leibstandarte was constructed along exactly those lines, and the construction was deliberate at every stage. From the height requirements that made the unit visually imposing, to the oath that made loyalty personal rather than institutional, to the ceremonial appearances that made them nationally visible, to the expanding military training that made them genuinely formidable, every element reinforced every other element. By the late 1930s, the unit had achieved a kind of terrible coherence. They believed in themselves with the conviction of men who had been told since their recruitment that they represented something exceptional, and in certain purely military terms, by 1939, they were beginning to be right. What Munich's political violence had required in 1923 was a few dozen men willing to put their bodies between one agitator and the crowd. What that impulse had grown into 16 years later was a motorized infantry formation preparing to cross an international border into sovereign territory. The distance between those 2 points is the distance that ambition, ideology, state power, and sustained institutional investment can travel when they move together in the same direction without significant resistance. The Leibstandarte had not become dangerous by accident. They had been made dangerous, piece by piece, selection by selection, oath by oath, shaped into an instrument whose purpose was always, at its core, the projection and protection of one man's will. The battles ahead would test whether an institution built on those foundations could survive contact with a world that had decided, at great cost, to resist. They were not yet an army, not in any traditional sense. When Germany crossed into Poland in the early hours of the 1st of September 1939, the Leibstandarte rolled forward as part of a larger Wehrmacht machine, still proving themselves, still carrying the weight of skepticism that regular army commanders had never quite bothered to hide. The professional officer class of the Wehrmacht had long viewed the Waffen-SS formations with a particular brand of institutional contempt. These were political soldiers, the argument went, men selected for their chin lines and their loyalty certificates rather than their battlefield competence. The Leibstandarte had trained hard, drilled relentlessly, and believed in their own mythology with a fervour that made sober military minds uneasy. Poland would be their first real answer to that skepticism, and the answer, as first answers so often are, would be complicated. The campaign in Poland moved fast. German armoured columns cut through the Polish frontier in coordinated thrusts, and the Leibstandarte advanced with the 10th Army in the south, participating in the drive that would eventually encircle and reduce Polish resistance in the west of the country. For the men of the unit, the speed of early gains was intoxicating. Villages appeared and fell behind them in hours. Roads that Polish defenders had expected to contest for days were in German hands by morning. The mechanized energy of the advance fed a sense of invincibility, the feeling that preparation and aggression, combined, were simply unstoppable. But Poland was not a training exercise, and the Poles were not a broken people. They fought back with a ferocity that cost the Leibstandarte something nobody had advertised in the recruitment pamphlets: real casualties, in real numbers, from a real enemy. The unit's performance in Poland drew a pattern that would define them for years to come. Where they committed fully, they pushed through. Where they encountered stiff resistance, they sometimes stalled, regrouped, and pushed again with a bluntness that substituted aggression for finesse. Senior Wehrmacht officers observed these engagements and filed their assessments with varying degrees of charity. Some conceded the unit's fighting spirit. Others noted tactical problems, a tendency toward recklessness, officers leading from the front in ways that exposed command elements to unnecessary risk, small unit coordination that still required refinement. The Leibstandarte were learning their trade in the only classroom that truly teaches it. The Polish campaign lasted barely more than 5 weeks in its main phase, but within those weeks, the unit absorbed lessons that no peacetime maneuver could have delivered. Losses among junior officers were notable. The cost of leading from the front announced itself early. It is worth pausing here, in the dust of that September, to acknowledge something that the propaganda apparatus of the Reich worked energetically to obscure. The Leibstandarte's conduct in Poland was not limited to battlefield engagements. Documented incidents of violence against Polish civilians and prisoners of war cast a shadow over the campaign record that no tactical achievement can balance. These were not isolated aberrations occurring at the edges of the unit's awareness. They were part of a broader pattern of behavior that would follow the Leibstandarte across the Eastern Front and beyond, rooted in the ideological framework that had been built into the unit's identity from its very formation. The fighting quality that their commanders praised and the brutality that characterized some of their operations were not separate phenomena. They grew from the same soil. Less than 8 months later, the Leibstandarte stood on the western frontier. France, in the spring of 1940, was the campaign the world watched, and the world could not quite believe. German armoured columns burst through the Ardennes in a manoeuvre that French and British strategic planners had considered extremely unlikely, and the result was a collapse that stunned even those executing it. The Leibstandarte was part of that advance, pushing through the Low Countries and then into France itself as part of the larger armoured drive that cut Allied forces in two. The sheer pace of the campaign created a kind of controlled chaos that the unit had to navigate in real time. Roads clogged with refugees and burning vehicles, orders arriving that described objectives already overtaken by events, company commanders making decisions that generals had assumed would never need to be made at that level. The fall of France took just over 6 weeks from the moment the German offensive began in earnest. Within that window, the Leibstandarte moved faster and farther than anything in living military memory, and the men who survived it carried that experience as a kind of physical understanding that no amount of subsequent briefing could replicate. They had seen a modern army disintegrate. They had watched formations that should have held, fold. They had fought their way through positions that were theoretically defensible and emerged on the other side with growing confidence that speed, aggression, and the willingness to accept risk in the short term could paralyze a conventional enemy completely. This was the core lesson of 1940. And it was a lesson the Leibstandarte absorbed so deeply that it would take the Eastern Front to begin dismantling it. France also produced moments of sharp tactical difficulty that the victory narrative tended to smooth over. British and French rearguard actions, particularly around the Dunkirk perimeter and at various points along the Channel coast, extracted genuine costs from German units that pressed too hard without adequate preparation. The Leibstandarte encountered counterattacks that required rapid adjustment, and there were engagements where numerical or positional disadvantage forced the kind of grinding defensive reactive fighting that their training had not particularly emphasized. These moments mattered. They revealed cracks in the assumption that forward momentum was always available on demand. They also demonstrated that the unit's discipline held under pressure. Whatever else might be said of them, the Leibstandarte did not break when pushed back. They absorbed punishment and reorganized. That resilience, unglamorous as it was, proved more durable than any of their celebrated advances. The France campaign also produced a darker episode that cannot be passed over. At a location in the north of France, soldiers of the Leibstandarte were responsible for the killing of British prisoners of war, men who had already surrendered and laid down their arms. This was not rumour or post-war allegation assembled from thin evidence. It was documented, investigated even within the context of wartime, and it established with clarity that what had occurred in Poland was not an artifact of a particular theatre or a particular chaos. The pattern was present again in a Western European campaign against soldiers of a major Western power. The ideological identity of the unit was not a veneer over an otherwise conventional military formation. It ran through the institution, shaping behavior in ways that would continue to define the unit's record. By the close of the French campaign, the Leibstandarte had accumulated a battlefield reputation that was, at minimum, double-edged. Within the German military establishment, the unit had demonstrated that it could fight. The Wehrmacht generals who had questioned whether political soldiers could perform in sustained combat had been given evidence, at least partial, that the answer was affirmative. Unit citations accumulated. Decorations were awarded. The propaganda machinery took the raw material of the campaign and processed it into something luminous. The image of unbeatable warriors carrying the new order forward on the tips of their rifles. For a German public being managed on carefully controlled information, this picture was entirely coherent. For the men inside the formation, reality was more textured. Casualties across the two campaigns had been real and felt. The junior officer corps had been tested in ways that exposed gaps between theoretical training and combat reality. Mechanical and logistical problems had slowed operations at critical moments. There had been confusion, miscommunication, and at least several engagements that went wrong before they went right. The gap between the unit the Leibstandarte was publicly presented as being and the unit that actually existed, experienced, capable, but also still developing, still making costly mistakes, was already present in 1940. It would not close. If anything, it would widen, because the propaganda continued to grow in ambition, while the actual challenges facing the unit grew in scale. There is something worth holding on to as these early campaigns recede and the shroud of the Eastern Front begins to grow at the edge of the frame. The men who had survived Poland and France were, in a purely technical sense, combat veterans. They understood things about movement under fire, about the management of fear in a fighting unit, about the gap between the map and the ground that could not be taught any other way. That experience was real and it was earned, but experience earned in campaigns where structural advantages were overwhelming, where German planning, equipment, and momentum had been so superior that victory felt almost inevitable in retrospect, was a particular kind of experience. It prepared men well for winning. It prepared them considerably less well for the specific education that was now approaching, the education of what it means to fight an enemy who absorbs everything you throw and keeps coming. That lesson had not yet been delivered. The Leibstandarte emerged from France battle-hardened, decorated, and already enshrined in the mythology of a state that would increasingly require myths to sustain itself. What they did not know, riding east toward a border that stretched across an entire continent, was that the myths were already beginning to age faster than the men who carried them. The 22nd of June 1941 began before sunrise. Across a front stretching more than 3,000 kilometers, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the largest military operation in human history lurched into motion. German artillery opened up in the pre-dawn darkness, and millions of men crossed into Soviet territory simultaneously. Among them, rolling forward on roads still wet with morning dew, was the Leibstandarte. They moved as part of Army Group South, pushing into Ukraine with the confidence of men who had never yet been stopped. The campaigns in Poland and France had hardened them, thinned out the weak, and confirmed in the minds of many that German arms were simply superior to anything the world could field. They rolled east, carrying that certainty like additional armor. They had no reason yet to question it. The opening weeks seemed to validate everything the German High Command believed. Soviet formations collapsed before them in ways that appeared almost theatrical. Whole armies encircled, prisoners counted in the tens of thousands, equipment abandoned along roadsides still running and fueled. The Leibstandarte punched through initial defensive lines with practiced aggression, their combined arms coordination functioning exactly as designed. Motorized infantry moved up alongside armor, clearing villages and river crossings before defenders could consolidate. Radio discipline was sharp, officers decisive, logistics, for the moment, adequate. Speed was the weapon, and they wielded it fluently. The Red Army, in those early weeks, seemed to be crumbling at the seams. But beneath the apparent collapse, something more complicated was already taking shape. Soviet units fought with an irregular, uneven quality that confounded simple prediction. Some formations broke and scattered at first contact. Others stood and died in positions long after rational military calculation would have demanded withdrawal. There was no consistent pattern, no reliable formula for measuring what a given Soviet unit would do when pressed. The Leibstandarte encountered both extremes within days of each other. A regiment that evaporated before a single probing attack, then a battalion dug into a tree line that simply refused to move regardless of pressure or casualties. German officers logged these observations without yet assembling them into a strategic conclusion. They were still winning after all. The anomalies felt like noise. The terrain itself began to make its presence felt. Ukraine in summer was not France. Roads that looked serviceable on maps turned to rutted mud after a single day of traffic by heavy vehicles. Dust rose in columns so thick that drivers could not see the vehicle ahead, coating everything in a pale grey layer that worked its way into engine filters, optical equipment, and rifle actions. Heat, flies, and contaminated water sources became operational factors alongside enemy contact. Vehicles broke down at rates that alarmed maintenance crews working around the clock to keep the advance moving. The Leibstandarte's motorization, so decisive in Western Europe's compact road network, now had to function across distances that multiplied every logistical problem by orders of magnitude. Spare parts took longer to arrive. Fuel consumption exceeded projections. The math of a long war was beginning to show itself in the margins. Through the summer months, the division fought its way deeper into Soviet territory, racking up tactical successes that would have been the defining achievements of any other campaign. River crossings were forced under fire. Towns were taken and held against counterattack. Enemy armored formations were engaged and defeated in open country. Commanders filed action reports with the kind of language that reads cleanly from the outside. Objectives seized, enemy routed, positions consolidated. But inside those reports, if you look at the casualty tallies, a different story was already accumulating. The Leibstandarte was losing men, not catastrophically yet, not in the numbers that would come later, but persistently, daily, in the way that a slow leak drains a tank. Replacements arrived, but the replacements were not the men they replaced. The Soviet capacity to absorb punishment and continue functioning was unlike anything the division had encountered in the West. In France and Poland, breaking a unit meant breaking an army. Destroy enough formations, collapse enough headquarters, and the structure above them simply ceased to function. On the Eastern Front, that logic kept failing to deliver final results. The Red Army was reconstituting itself as it retreated, drawing on populations and industrial resources that no one in German planning had correctly measured. Factories were being dismantled and moved east of the Ural Mountains, even as fighting raged in the west. Reserve armies were forming in the depths of the country, beyond the reach of German reconnaissance and intelligence. The Leibstandarte could win every engagement in front of them and still not be approaching an endpoint. The enemy's capacity to replace what was lost was simply not running out. By autumn, the strategic picture that had looked so clean in June had become vastly more complicated. German forces were still advancing, but the pace had slowed noticeably. The three great objectives, Leningrad, Moscow, Kiev, were proving to be moving targets that receded as they were approached. Army Group South, where the Leibstandarte operated, had achieved enormous territorial gains, but the Soviet forces opposing them had not been destroyed in the decisive encirclements that German doctrine required. Pockets had been closed, yes, and prisoners taken in staggering numbers, but always there were more Soviet forces beyond the last horizon. Officers who had expected the campaign to conclude before winter began making mental calculations about cold weather operations that official planning had never seriously addressed. The army had been told it would not need winter equipment. That statement was beginning to look less like confidence and more like denial. The Leibstandarte's tactical adaptation during this period revealed both their quality and the limits of that quality. They learned quickly. Formations adjusted to the terrain, to Soviet tactics, to the particular rhythms of combat on this front. Anti-tank procedures were refined after encountering Soviet armor that proved more resilient than expected. Infantry learned to clear settlements methodically rather than bypassing them, because bypassed defenders had a habit of becoming rear area problems. Artillery coordination grew tighter through practice. These were genuine improvements, earned in blood and applied with professionalism. But adaptation to the conditions of a particular war is not the same thing as being able to win that war. The division could become perfectly suited to Eastern Front combat and still face structural disadvantages that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. There was also the question of what the fighting was doing to the men themselves. The Leibstandarte had gone into the Soviet Union as an ideologically prepared, physically selected, operationally experienced formation. They were not raw troops, but the Eastern Front operated on a different psychological register than anything their preparation had accounted for. Distances were enormous, isolation was persistent, and the enemy showed a tenacity and willingness to accept casualty rates that should, by Western military logic, have produced surrender long before they did. Soldiers who had felt invincible in France found themselves grinding through forests and river valleys against resistance that simply did not follow the script. Exhaustion deepened. The ideological framework that told these men they were racially superior warriors began to compete with the direct evidence of their senses, which told them that the opponent in front of them was fighting with tremendous ferocity and not going away. The gap between the mythology that surrounded the Leibstandarte and the reality of what they were experiencing grew slowly but measurably through the summer and into the autumn of 1941. Propaganda organs continued to produce their portrait of unstoppable elite soldiers, cutting through enemy lines with effortless superiority. The men in those lines knew a different version. They knew about the comrade who had been killed by a sniper in a village they had supposedly secured. They knew about the night ambushes in terrain their maps had shown as clear. They knew the particular weight of advancing toward a position that had been reported destroyed by artillery, only to find it still defended. None of this broke the Leibstandarte, not yet, but it was accumulating quietly in the way that stress accumulates in metal before it fractures. As autumn turned toward winter and the distant spires of Moscow remained beyond reach, the campaign that was supposed to have concluded months ago showed no signs of conclusion. The Leibstandarte found itself in southern Russia, still fighting, still advancing in places, still tactically effective, but increasingly aware that the strategic framework around them was not delivering what it had promised. Blitzkrieg was a doctrine built on shock, speed, and the enemy's psychological collapse. It worked when the enemy's will and capacity to resist were finite. Against the Soviet Union, those quantities had proven to be something closer to inexhaustible. The division that had crossed the frontier in June, with total confidence, was not the same formation by November. It was still formidable, it was still disciplined, but it now carried, beneath its professionalism, the beginning of a question it could not answer. What does winning actually look like here? That question would not get easier in the months ahead. By the time the first snows fell across the Soviet steppe in late 1941, something had already begun to break. Not just equipment, not just supply lines, but the invisible architecture of certainty that had carried German forces from the Polish border to within striking distance of Moscow. The Leibstandarte had crossed into Soviet territory in the summer of that year as part of an army that believed, with genuine conviction, that the campaign would be finished before winter arrived. It was not an irrational belief. Poland had taken weeks. France had taken 6. Every calculation pointed toward a Soviet collapse before the cold could become a factor. And so when the temperature began its slow, merciless descent, German forces found themselves in a situation nobody had fully prepared for, wearing uniforms designed for autumn, holding positions across hundreds of kilometers of frozen ground, facing an enemy that had not collapsed on schedule. The logistical architecture that had seemed adequate for a summer campaign now revealed every crack and limitation. Supply trains stretched back across enormous distances, and the Soviet rail gauge differed from the German standard, meaning that captured lines had to be laboriously converted before they could carry German material eastward. Winter clothing existed in German depots. There were coats, boots, proper gloves, but the transport bottleneck meant that much of it sat far to the rear, while soldiers at the front improvised with whatever they could find. Men wrapped their feet in newspaper and straw. Officers requisitioned civilian clothing from nearby villages. The contrast with the Wehrmacht's motorized modernity was not lost on anyone who lived through it. Machines that had sliced through Soviet formations in summer now refused to start in the pre-dawn darkness when temperatures fell to 30 degrees below zero and engine oil turned viscous as cold tar. The Leibstandarte, positioned within the broader push toward Moscow, had experienced these deteriorating conditions alongside every other German formation. What made their situation particular was the weight of their own reputation. They had been told, and had largely believed, that they were Germany's finest, the personal instrument of the Reich's will, the tip of the spear that nothing could blunt. The Eastern Campaign's opening months had done little to challenge that self-image. They had advanced rapidly, captured objectives, demonstrated the kind of aggressive momentum that their training had built into them. But momentum requires fuel and ammunition, and men who can hold weapons in hands that have not lost feeling. By November 1941, all 3 of those things were becoming dangerously scarce. Soviet resistance, meanwhile, was not collapsing. This was the fact that cut deepest against German assumptions, because the entire strategic logic of the campaign rested on the idea that Soviet manpower was ultimately finite and Soviet morale ultimately fragile. Neither proved true at the critical hour. What German intelligence had consistently underestimated was the depth of reserves that the Soviet state could mobilize. Divisions from Siberia, formations from Central Asia, men who had trained in cold conditions, and who understood instinctively what German soldiers were only now discovering about winter warfare. The Soviets had also moved significant industrial capacity east of the Ural Mountains, beyond the range of any German advance, ensuring that the machinery of war production kept grinding regardless of what happened at the front. German planners had built their campaign on an assumption that did not survive contact with Soviet reality. The counteroffensive that struck German lines in early December of 1941 came as a shock that no amount of retrospective rationalization can adequately describe. Soviet forces under their command structure launched coordinated attacks along a massive front, targeting German units that were already exhausted, already cold, already operating at the outer edge of their supply capacity. The Leibstandarte found itself pulled into defensive actions of a kind that ran against everything in their doctrinal DNA. They had been trained to attack, to exploit, to maintain pressure until the enemy broke. Now they were holding ground they had taken, in temperatures their equipment was never designed for, against an enemy that had somehow gathered the strength to push back. The psychological impact was profound and lasting. These were men who had watched France crumble in weeks. Watching Soviet formations advance in the snow toward positions that were supposed to have been springboards for further German gains was a different category of experience entirely. The physical suffering during those winter months was immense. Frostbite moved through German units with a systematic efficiency that no Soviet weapon could match. A soldier who stood watch for too long in the wrong conditions did not need to be shot to become a casualty. He simply stopped being able to fight. Medical facilities were overwhelmed not by wound trauma alone, but by the cascading effects of extreme cold on men whose bodies had never been conditioned for it. Vehicles broke down and could not be recovered because the ground was too hard and the towing capacity had been consumed elsewhere. Artillery pieces had to be kept firing at intervals through the night, not for tactical purposes, but simply to prevent their mechanisms from freezing solid. The picture that emerges from accounts of those months is one of absolute institutional stress. An army still technically formidable, trying to sustain itself through sheer will against conditions it had not anticipated. The Leibstandarte's identity took particular damage in this period because their mythology had always rested on a premise of superiority that cold weather did not respect. Elite status carries a burden as well as a privilege. When ordinary units struggled, it could be attributed to their ordinariness, to the friction of war, to circumstances. When an elite unit struggled, the questions cut deeper. What did it mean that Germany's finest soldiers were holding improvised defensive lines with frostbitten hands, scraping frozen mud from weapon mechanisms, relying on captured Soviet equipment because their own had failed? The answer, if anyone at the time was prepared to articulate it honestly, was that the campaign had exposed a structural vulnerability that no amount of training or ideological commitment could compensate for. Wars are ultimately won by the side that can sustain itself, and in the winter of 1941 to 1942, Germany's capacity for sustained operations in this theatre had been critically overestimated. German command decisions during this period compounded the difficulty. Hitler's order that German forces hold their positions rather than conducting tactical withdrawals to more defensible ground was a source of bitter controversy that would echo through every subsequent chapter of the Eastern Front War. There were genuine arguments on both sides. A retreat risked becoming a rout, and the distances involved in any withdrawal were themselves dangerous in winter conditions. But the cost of holding exposed salients and forward positions that had no logistical depth was paid in lives and equipment that the German army could not easily replace. The Leibstandarte, like many formations, found itself locked into positions that demanded constant effort simply to maintain, effort that consumed resources needed for any kind of future offensive action. They held, but holding was not what they had been built for. It was during this winter that the gap between the Leibstandarte as a propaganda institution and the Leibstandarte as a collection of cold, exhausted, frightened human beings became impossible to ignore internally. Their status in German public consciousness remained burnished. The home front received carefully curated accounts of heroic resistance and tactical brilliance under pressure, and there was genuine heroism in the grinding defensive work of those months. But the men living through it knew that something had changed. The easy confidence of the summer advance, the sense that this war would follow the same arc as every previous German campaign, was gone. In its place was something harder and less comfortable, the knowledge that the Soviet Union was not going to collapse, that the war in the East was going to be long, and that the resources required to win it might not exist. Soviet operations through the winter of 41 to 42 did not achieve a decisive breakthrough against German lines, though they came closer than the official histories produced in later years sometimes acknowledged. German forces bent significantly without breaking, and the front eventually stabilized into something resembling a coherent defensive line once the worst of the Soviet offensive energy had been spent. The Leibstandarte could point to their role in that stabilization as evidence of their continued combat effectiveness, and the evidence was real. They had fought defensively under the worst conditions of the war to that point, and had not disintegrated. That was a genuine accomplishment, but it was categorically different from what they had been in France, and everyone in the formation understood the difference, even if the distinction was not one that could be spoken aloud in any official communication. When the German line finally stabilized, and the worst of the winter began to ease into a bitter, incomplete spring, the men of the Leibstandarte had been marked by the experience in ways that would not fully surface for months. The cold had taught them something that victory had never had to. They had learned that the enemy they faced was neither brittle nor temporary, that the war they were fighting operated on a scale that dwarfed anything their doctrine had been designed for, and that the arithmetic of attrition, casualties taken versus casualties inflicted, equipment lost versus equipment produced, territory held versus territory that could actually be supplied, was working against them in ways that no tactical excellence could fully reverse. The mythology of invincibility had not been destroyed entirely, but it had been cracked, and in the hairline fractures left by a Russian winter, the seeds of everything that would follow at Kharkov, at Kursk, and beyond had already been quietly sown. The winter had not been kind. Along the frozen approaches to Moscow and across the snow-buried plains of the east, the Leibstandarte had learned something that no amount of pre-war training or ideological conviction could have prepared them for: that the Soviet Union was not a country that could be broken by a single, overwhelming blow. They had fought hard, they had bled, and now, in the early weeks of 1942, they were being pulled back, not in disgrace, but in something almost as uncomfortable for soldiers who had known nothing but forward momentum, stillness. The order to withdraw to rear areas for rest and reorganization was framed in the clean administrative language of high command, but the men who received it understood its real meaning. The machine needed repairs, and so did they. The formation that assembled in those rear staging areas was visibly different from the one that had crossed into the Soviet Union months earlier. The faces were older in the way that only combat ages men, not by years, but by something harder to name, a compression of experience that shows in the eyes before it shows anywhere else. Equipment was battered, vehicles were worn through, and the unit's authorized strength existed more on paper than in the actual men standing in formation. What the Leibstandarte had demonstrated in Poland and France, that speed and aggression could substitute for overwhelming numbers, had run directly into the one enemy those qualities could not defeat: attrition across a front too wide and a winter too deep. The withdrawal was not a retreat from ideology, but it was, unmistakably, a retreat from illusion. German military planners at the highest levels had been watching the Eastern Front's arithmetic with growing unease. The gap between what the Wehrmacht was being asked to do and what it actually possessed to do it was no longer a gap, it was a chasm. The Leibstandarte, as one of the formations most closely tied to Hitler's personal prestige and most visible in propaganda, was among the first earmarked for substantial rebuilding. What was planned was not merely a replenishment of losses, it was a fundamental reconception of what the unit would be. The word being used in planning documents was expansion, from motorized infantry regiment to full Panzer Grenadier division. The ambition was significant. The practical challenges were enormous. Recruitment had always been central to the Leibstandarte's identity, and those standards now came under pressure from two directions simultaneously. The first was the demand for bodies, more men, enough to fill out a divisional order of battle where previously a regimental one had sufficed. The second was the insistence, from SS leadership and from the unit's own culture, that quality could not be sacrificed for quantity. These two pressures did not resolve cleanly. The replacement soldiers who arrived through the early and middle months of 1942 were younger, in some cases markedly so, and lacked the years of pre-war formation and drilling that had shaped the unit's original core. Veteran non-commissioned officers were assigned to work these men into something approaching combat readiness, conducting intensive training that tried to compress years of institutional knowledge into weeks. Some of it took, some of it did not. The Leibstandarte's reputation survived the transition, but its texture quietly changed. The equipment arriving in those rear areas told its own story about where German industry and German strategy were heading. New armoured vehicles began to appear in greater numbers, heavier and better armoured than what had been fielded before. The light and medium tanks that had swept through France and driven deep into the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 were showing their limits against Soviet armour, which had improved steadily since the terrible losses of the early campaigns. The Leibstandarte now began receiving vehicles capable of standing in direct confrontation with Soviet tanks, rather than simply outmaneuvering them. Alongside the armour came more artillery, heavier mortars, additional anti-tank capacity, and improved signals equipment. The transformation was not just cosmetic. The division that would emerge from this period would carry more weight in every literal and military sense of the phrase. Motorization had been a partial reality in the Leibstandarte's earlier configurations, but the reorganization pushed this much further. Supply chains, medical units, engineering elements, all of these were brought into a more coherent motorized structure, reducing the division's dependence on horse-drawn logistics that had strangled so many German operations during the previous winter. There was a recognition, painful to acknowledge given the cavalry traditions that still ran through German military culture, that modern mechanized warfare demanded mechanized everything, not just the striking elements at the front. A tank division that could not be fueled, fed, and reinforced at the same tempo as it advanced was simply a collection of expensive machines waiting to run out of road. The reform addressed this with the seriousness it deserved, even if resource constraints meant the result was never quite as complete as the blueprints envisioned. Tactical doctrine also underwent scrutiny during this period, because the Eastern Front had exposed weaknesses in how the Leibstandarte, and in fact most German formations, had been trained to fight. The Blitzkrieg model depended on disruption, punch through the enemy's front, race into his rear areas, and collapse his ability to respond before he could reorganize. Against the Soviet Union, this had worked spectacularly in the summer of 1941. But the Soviet military was not static. It was learning, adapting, absorbing catastrophic losses, and then continuing to fight in ways that orthodox German tactical thinking had not fully anticipated. The response was not to abandon the core principles of German operational art, but to adapt them, to develop better methods for dealing with Soviet defensive depth, better coordination between armor and infantry, and a more sophisticated understanding of how Soviet commanders were beginning to use their reserves. The Leibstandarte's officers spent considerable time during the reorganization period studying their own after-action reports with unusual honesty. There is a particular kind of institutional courage required to look at a record of victories and ask what those victories concealed, what went wrong, even when the final result read as a success. The losses the unit had sustained were not trivial. They had been serious, and in some engagements the margin between success and disaster had been narrower than anyone wished to admit in official accounts. The training programs developed during the reorganization reflected this analysis. Officers practiced combined arms coordination in exercises that tried to replicate the density and resilience of Soviet defensive systems. Infantry trained to work more closely with armor and artillery rather than advancing in the relative isolation that had served reasonably well in earlier campaigns. The lessons were hard-won. The application of them would be tested soon enough. SS leadership used this period of reorganization to reinforce something that was, in many ways, the most problematic element of the Leibstandarte's identity: its ideological character. The political and racial indoctrination that had always accompanied military training was not relaxed during the rebuilding phase. If anything, it intensified, as commanders were acutely aware that the mythology of invincibility had taken damage and needed reconstruction. Soldiers were told that the setbacks of the previous winter were temporary, that Germany's industrial strength and military skill would ultimately prevail, that their particular place in the war's story was one of elite distinction rather than ordinary attrition. This framing served obvious morale purposes. It also, more quietly, served to insulate the men from questions that, if seriously entertained, might undermine the will to return to the front. The ideology was not incidental to the unit. It was structural. By mid-1942, the rebuilt formation was beginning to look recognizable as what its commanders intended it to become. The administrative expansion was substantially complete on paper, though as with almost every German military formation in this period, the authorized tables of organization were ideals rather than precise descriptions of what actually existed. Units were under strength in some areas and overstocked in others. Equipment allocations were partially fulfilled, and the integration of new personnel with veterans was still an unfinished process. But the direction was clear. The Leibstandarte was no longer a large motorized regiment wearing the trappings of something greater. It was moving toward genuine divisional capability, multiple fighting arms, organic support, the kind of self-contained operational flexibility that commanders on a modern battlefield needed their elite formations to possess. What the reorganization could not do, and what no reorganization could have done, was address the fundamental strategic problem that the Eastern Front had revealed. More men, better tanks, improved tactics. All of these were meaningful incremental improvements. But the Soviet Union was not an incremental opponent. It was regenerating its own forces on a scale that no German reorganization could match, drawing on population reserves, industrial capacity being rebuilt beyond the Ural Mountains, and an increasingly sophisticated command structure that was learning from its own catastrophic early losses. The Leibstandarte emerged from its period of rebuilding stronger than it had entered it. That was real, and it mattered in the battles ahead. But stronger is a relative term. Stronger than what? Compared to what? Against what kind of opponent? On what kind of front? These were questions that the pride and discipline of reorganization could set aside for a while, but could not answer. The men who climbed back onto their vehicles and turned east again were better equipped and better organized than they had been before. They were also heading back into an arithmetic that was, slowly and irrevocably, turning against them. By the summer of 1942, Germany was moving again. The grinding paralysis of the previous winter, the frozen soldiers, the broken tanks, the shattered myth of a swift Eastern War, had given way to something that looked, at least from a distance, like momentum restored. Operation Blue, the great southern offensive, pushed vast columns of Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS formations deep into the Soviet interior, reaching toward the Caucasus oil fields and the Great Bend of the Volga. For the men of the Leibstandarte, assigned to the southern axis of this drive, the wide steppes felt almost like a return to the old certainties. The summer sky was enormous. The columns moved fast, and for a few weeks, the fear that had taken root outside Moscow seemed to recede. But those who had been on the Eastern Front long enough knew better than to trust the season's confidence. The land absorbed armies the way dark water absorbs light, quietly, completely, without a ripple of concern. The Leibstandarte moved through southern Russia in the summer of 1942 as part of a massive German strategic gamble, one designed to strangle Soviet industry and fuel supplies at their source. The objectives were breathtaking in their ambition: reach the Caucasus Mountains, secure the oil of Baku, cut the Volga at Stalingrad, and sever the Soviet Union's southern logistical arteries in a single campaign season. The division participated in the early phases of this push, driving through the Don steppe and into territory that had never before seen German soldiers. Villages were left behind, roads thinned and then vanished. The supply lines that were supposed to follow the advance struggled to keep pace, with a front moving faster than logistics could reasonably support. This was the old blitzkrieg confidence dressed in new geography, and it carried with it all the old vulnerabilities: stretched thin, dependent on speed, allergic to resistance. What the Germans did not fully reckon with, at least not in time, was the degree to which Soviet resistance had evolved since 1941. The Red Army of mid-1942 was not the shattered, disorganized force that had collapsed in huge pockets during Barbarossa. It had been hurt, yes, hurt to a degree that would have broken almost any other military organization in the world. But it had not broken. Soviet commanders had learned, painfully and at enormous cost, how to conduct fighting withdrawals that preserved force rather than sacrificing it in hopeless encirclements. When the Leibstandarte and its companion formations pressed forward, they often found that the enemy slipped backward rather than standing to be destroyed, trading space for time, and always, feeding new formations into the line from depths that seemed inexhaustible. The steppe was vast. The Soviet army was vaster. Through the long summer, the Leibstandarte was committed to a series of actions that tested both its tactical skill and its physical endurance. Heat replaced the cold as the primary enemy of the body. Temperatures climbed until the metal of vehicles became too hot to touch without cloth. Water discipline became as critical as ammunition discipline. Dust rose in columns so thick that men navigating at the rear of a formation could lose sight of the vehicles ahead of them within moments. The terrain itself seemed indifferent to human urgency. Rolling grassland that offered little cover, occasional ravines that funneled armor into kill zones, river crossings where Soviet rearguards could exact a toll before dissolving into the distance. The division fought well by any professional measure, but fighting well and achieving decisive results were becoming, slowly and uncomfortably, different things. As summer gave way to autumn, the broader German strategic picture began to fracture at its edges. At Stalingrad, the drive to the Volga had transformed from a war of movement into something no German planner had intended, a brutal, grinding urban battle that consumed men and machines at a rate the Reich could not sustain indefinitely. The city became an obsession for Hitler, a symbolic prize that drained resources from every other sector of the southern front. Units that might have reinforced progress in the Caucasus were redirected. Objectives that had seemed within reach in July began to slip backward in October. For the Leibstandarte, the implications were significant, if not yet catastrophic. The operational environment was changing around them, even when their own positions held. The initiative that had characterized German operations since the spring was becoming harder to locate. The Caucasus campaign itself stalled short of its objectives. The oil fields remained beyond reach. The mountain passes that might have carried German forces toward the Caspian held firm against advances that ran short of both men and momentum. Winter came again, the second winter for those Leibstandarte veterans who had survived the first, and it arrived with the same indifference it had shown the year before. Cold was cold. Frostbite did not distinguish between ideological commitment and physical vulnerability. Men who had marched into the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, believing in swift victory, now huddled in positions dug from frozen earth, eating what could be brought forward, fighting to hold what they had, rather than seizing what they had been ordered to capture. The offensive posture that defined the Leibstandarte's identity was, in the southern theatre, becoming something else. Then came the news that changed everything. In November of 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive armoured encirclement that cut around the flanks of the German position at Stalingrad and trapped an entire German army inside the city. The scale of what had happened took time to fully register even at the highest command levels. For soldiers in the field, it arrived as rumour first, then as the particular kind of silence that falls over men when they understand that the strategic ground beneath them has shifted without warning. The Leibstandarte was not trapped at Stalingrad, but the disaster there cast its weight across every German formation in the south. The question was no longer how far the advance would reach. The question was whether the front could be held at all. The months that followed were among the most demanding in the division's history. As Soviet forces pressed their advantage following the Stalingrad encirclement, German units across the southern theatre were forced into fighting retreats of a kind few of them had trained for. The Leibstandarte, redeployed and reconsolidated in the early weeks of 1943, found itself in an operational role fundamentally different from anything its original character had anticipated. Breakthrough and exploitation, the skills drilled into its men through years of training, gave way to holding actions, counterattacks against superior numbers, and the ugly arithmetic of buying time. Units that had been structured around the assumption of continuous forward movement now had to learn, quickly and under fire, how to absorb pressure without dissolving. It was during this period that something important was revealed about the Leibstandarte's genuine military character. A formation built on ideological mythology and showpiece presentation might have shattered under this kind of pressure. Instead, The division demonstrated a professional resilience that went beyond its propaganda image. Small unit tactics held together even when larger operational structures were crumbling. Officers adapted, NCOs improvised. The same rigorous training that had produced swagger also produced competence, and competence, when applied to survival rather than conquest, proved durable in ways that surprised even those who had dismissed the Waffen-SS as a political creation masquerading as a military one. The Leibstandarte was dangerous, not because of what it believed, but because of how it fought, and that quality remained intact even as strategic circumstances darkened around it. By early 1943, the Leibstandarte had been pulled back from the worst of the southern collapse and was being reconstituted in the rear areas. It was during this period that planning began for the counter-offensive operations around Kharkov that would briefly restore a measure of German military credibility before Kursk consumed it. But the months in the south had left their mark in ways that no reorganization could fully erase. Equipment had been worn down, men had been lost, not in catastrophic single engagements, but in the slow, grinding attrition of sustained operations conducted at the edge of physical and logistical limits. The division that emerged from the southern campaign was experienced in a way it had not been before, tempered by conditions that went beyond anything the early years of the war had produced. What the Caucasus and Stalingrad period ultimately demonstrated was that the war Germany was now fighting bore almost no resemblance to the war it had started. The clean operational arcs of blitzkrieg, the encirclements, the collapses, the breathless advances across hundreds of kilometers, had given way to something older and more brutal. This was a war of endurance now, of industrial mass against industrial mass, of population against population, of a Soviet state that had decided it would absorb any cost necessary to survive. The Leibstandarte could win individual engagements. It could outfight comparable Soviet units at the tactical level with troubling consistency. What it could not do, what no German formation could do, was win a war of attrition against an enemy with more men, more factories, more space, and more determination to endure. The summer of 1942's confidence had been bled away across 800 kilometers of steppe and mountain, and what remained was a division that understood, even if it could not yet say so openly, that the war had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The road from the Caucasus pointed north and west, back toward Kharkov, toward the temporary redemption of a spring counteroffensive, and beyond that, toward a salient in the Russian steppe, where the largest armored battle in history was being planned by men on both sides who believed, for different reasons and with different levels of justification, that they could shape what came next. The Leibstandarte moved with those plans, hardened by experience, depleted by loss, and carrying with it the weight of everything the southern campaign had cost. They were still, by any measure, among the most capable fighting formations in the German order of battle. But capable and sufficient were no longer the same word, and somewhere in the steppes behind them, the shroud of Stalingrad stretched forward into every calculation, every order, every plan, a reminder of what happened when German military power collided with the full and terrible weight of Soviet strategic resolve. In the winter of 1942, the German Eastern Front had reached a crisis point. The Blitzkrieg dream was dying in the snow. Operation Barbarossa, which was meant to conquer the Soviet Union before winter set in, had instead left German forces stretched across a continent they could not hold, bleeding manpower they could not replace, consuming supplies they could not produce. The Leibstandarte, like the rest of the Wehrmacht, had learned a hard lesson. Speed and shock alone could not defeat an enemy with infinite space, infinite reserves, and the will to sacrifice whatever was necessary. By the time the spring thaw came in 1943, both sides understood they were locked in a different war now, not a war of movement and breakthrough, but a war of attrition and deep resources. The question facing German High Command was not whether they could win, but whether they could buy time, and Field Marshal Erich von Manstein believed he had found a way. In February and early March of 1943, Soviet forces in the Kharkov region committed a catastrophic error. Buoyed by their success at Stalingrad and underestimating German recovery capacity, they launched an ambitious offensive operation designed to liberate more territory and inflict further losses on the Wehrmacht. The Soviets, confident in their growing military machine, pushed forward with less caution than they would later demonstrate. This overextension created exactly the kind of opportunity that Manstein, one of Germany's finest operational minds, had been waiting for. He recognized that German forces, though weakened, still possessed superior training, tactics, and coordination. More importantly, he saw that Soviet supply lines were stretched thin, that reserve formations were not yet concentrated, and that a bold counteroffensive might not only halt the Soviet advance, but actually punch through and encircle significant Soviet forces. It was a gamble, but it was a gamble that Manstein believed could revitalize German fortunes on the Eastern Front, at least for a time. The Leibstandarte, having been withdrawn to rear areas for reorganization and rearmament after the brutal campaigns of 1942, was positioned in this southern sector. The division had undergone significant expansion and modernization. Where once it had been a smaller, elite motorized unit, it had grown into a true mechanized division, with armor support, artillery, and all the infrastructure of a major formation. New soldiers had been absorbed into its ranks, men who had not fought in Poland or France, who had not experienced the initial victories, but who had been trained in the hardening school of the Eastern Front. These replacements brought the Leibstandarte back to considerable strength. The unit still carried the reputation and the rigorous training standards of the earliest days. Command structure remained tight. Leadership remained fanatical in its commitment to offensive action, and morale, though tempered by experience, remained higher than in many other Wehrmacht formations. When Manstein's plan was communicated down through Army Group South's chain of command, the Leibstandarte received their orders with the understanding that they would play a key role in what was meant to be Germany's last triumphant counteroffensive. The operation, codenamed Unternehmen Hagelring in some German records, though more commonly known simply as the Kharkov counteroffensive or the Spring Offensive of 1943, began in early March. The Leibstandarte, operating as part of the 4th Panzer Army, was positioned to drive northward from the Dnipro River region toward Kharkov, the 4th largest city in the Soviet Union. The Germans planned for armored columns to strike through weakened sectors of the Soviet front, create breakthrough gaps, and then pour motorized forces and mechanized units into the Soviet rear areas. In theory, this would trap and destroy entire Soviet armies, or force them to retreat in disorder. The weather was treacherous. Spring mud, the Rasputitsa, was beginning to form as temperatures fluctuated and snow melted, turning roads and fields into swamps. But the Germans chose to attack anyway, accepting these conditions as a necessary price for seizing the initiative before the ground hardened and Soviet reinforcements arrived in greater numbers. The Leibstandarte advanced with armor in the vanguard, using panzer and assault gun formations to batter through Soviet defensive positions. In many places, Soviet forces were spread thin or caught mid-maneuver. German tactical coordination was still superior to what their Soviet counterparts could manage on these scales. Artillery concentrations, combined with armor-supported infantry assaults, broke through sector after sector. The division captured towns and territory with a speed that, by this point in the war, seemed almost miraculous. Soldiers who had endured the grueling defensive battles of 1942 found themselves advancing again, pursuing a retreating enemy, recapturing ground they had lost. For a brief moment, the mythology of German invincibility flickered back to life. Officers spoke of breakthrough. Intelligence reports suggested that large Soviet formations were in disarray. The possibility of a true operational success, not merely tactical victory, but genuine encirclement and destruction of major enemy forces, seemed tangible. By mid-March, the Leibstandarte was approaching Kharkov itself. The city had been captured by the Germans in 1941 during the opening phases of Barbarossa, then lost to the Soviets in the winter campaign of 1942, and now German forces were moving to recapture it. For many in the division, Kharkov represented vindication. The losses of the past year had not been in vain. The Wehrmacht, it seemed, was not finished. The advance reached the city's outskirts, and fighting became urban, street by street and building by building. Soviet defenders, though pressed back by superior German coordination and firepower, resisted fiercely in certain sectors. But the weight of German attack, concentrated and relentless, eventually overwhelmed these pockets of resistance. By the first week of March, accounts vary slightly on exact dates, Kharkov was back in German hands. The Leibstandarte had played a major role in this recapture, and it became one of their proudest achievements, a demonstration that the elite units of the SS were still capable of offensive operations and victory. The propaganda ministry in Berlin did not miss the opportunity. Images of German forces raising flags over Kharkov, of columns advancing through Soviet territory, of destroyed Soviet armor scattered across the steppes, all of this was disseminated through newsreels and radio broadcasts. The message was clear: Germany was striking back. The days of defensive struggles were ending. A new offensive phase was beginning. For the German population, exhausted by over a year of increasingly grim reports from the Eastern Front, Kharkov was a tonic. For soldiers in the Leibstandarte and other formations, it was proof that they could still accomplish great things. For the High Command, it validated Manstein's strategy and demonstrated that operational victories were still possible. But underneath this glittering surface, deeper truths were already visible to anyone willing to see them. The Soviet forces, despite being temporarily pushed back, were not destroyed. They had retreated in good order rather than being encircled and annihilated as Manstein had hoped. Soviet reserves were arriving faster than the German intelligence had predicted. The logistical strain on the German supply lines, stretched thin across vast distances, was already becoming apparent. Panzer losses were mounting faster than replacements could arrive from German factories. Fuel consumption in these breakthrough operations was immense, and German oil production could not keep pace. The Leibstandarte, victorious though they were, was bleeding strength in ways that went beyond the visible casualty rolls. Mechanical attrition, ammunition expenditure, fuel consumption, and the simple exhaustion of men and officers, these cumulative factors meant that the division was entering a state of gradual decline, even as it celebrated victory. The very operation that was meant to restore German offensive capability was burning through irreplaceable resources at a rate that could not be sustained. Manstein recognized these limitations even as he consolidated his tactical victory. His plan had been to drive even further north and west, to encircle Soviet forces in a broader operation, but he lacked the reserves and logistical support to sustain such ambitions. The Germans halted, regrouped, and prepared defensive positions to hold the ground they had recaptured. The offensive energy began to dissipate. Soviet reserves were being positioned in new defensive formations around the Kursk salient, hundreds of kilometers to the north. German intelligence was picking up reports of massive Soviet fortification efforts, anti-tank gun concentrations, and multiple defensive lines being constructed. By late March and early April of 1943, the period of German offensive action was already ending. What Kharkov had demonstrated was not a reversal of German fortunes, but rather a final flash of the old operational mastery, a demonstration of what the Wehrmacht was still capable of when it could concentrate superior forces at the point of attack. But it was a demonstration that consumed the very resources needed for what was already being planned as the next great offensive operation. The significance of Kharkov, therefore, lies not in what it accomplished, but in what it concealed. On the surface, it was a German victory. But it was a victory that proved to be the last major offensive triumph the Wehrmacht would achieve on the Eastern Front. It did not reverse the strategic tide. It did not create the conditions for German victory. It merely delayed German defeat for a few more months. It bought time that was measured in weeks, not years. The Leibstandarte had performed brilliantly in this operation, had demonstrated that elite units could still execute complex maneuvers and overcome determined opposition, but they had done so at the cost of strength they would never recover. Every tank lost at Kharkov could not be replaced with 3 new tanks. Every officer killed could not be replaced with 3 new officers. Every wounded soldier removed from the ranks could not be replaced with fresh recruits of equivalent training. The German military machine was slowly consuming itself, and Kharkov was part of that consumption. Within weeks of recapturing Kharkov, the Leibstandarte would receive orders to prepare for an even larger operation. This operation, codenamed Citadel, was meant to be the final demonstration of German offensive capability. It would involve the greatest concentration of armor and mechanized forces that Germany had yet assembled. It would target the Kursk salient, that bulge in the front lines where Soviet forces presented an apparent weakness. The planners in the German High Command believed that a massive, coordinated strike from north and south could encircle and destroy Soviet armies in a cauldron of their own making, just as the Wehrmacht had done so many times in 1941. The Leibstandarte was slated to play a crucial role in this operation, to form part of the spearhead that would drive into the Soviet defenses and achieve breakthrough. But the Soviet intelligence apparatus was already aware of these plans, in part through warnings from their agents in Switzerland and Germany itself. The spring offensive around Kharkov, therefore, marked a crucial turning point in the war, not because of what it achieved, but because of what it represented. It was the last time German operational planning would be based on the assumption that they possessed the strength to seize and maintain the initiative. It was the last time the Leibstandarte would fight in the mode they had been designed for: rapid breakthrough, exploitation of enemy weakness, aggressive combined arms maneuvers. After Kharkov, even when they won tactical battles, they would be losing the broader war. The victory at Kharkov masked this reality because it was fresh and visible and could be celebrated, but it was in truth a final echo of the old Germany, the Germany of blitzkrieg and conquest, the Germany that still believed victory was achievable through sufficient force applied with sufficient skill. The next major operation, already being prepared as spring turned towards summer, would teach harder lessons. Kursk would show the world, and would show Germany, that tactical brilliance and elite units and desperate courage could not overcome the fundamental mathematical realities of modern industrial warfare. But for now, in March and April of 1943, the Leibstandarte rested and refitted, still believing that the offensive spirit remained alive, still trusting that the next operation would produce the breakthrough that had eluded them since the winter of 1941. In the spring of 1943, as German planners debated whether Operation Citadel could succeed, a parallel conflict unfolded entirely beyond the battlefield. This was the intelligence war. In conference rooms in Berlin, Moscow, and field headquarters across the vast Eastern Front, officers and analysts studied maps, decrypted messages, and assessed their opponent's intentions with the kind of desperate precision that separates catastrophe from merely grave defeat. The Leibstandarte and every other combat unit preparing for the Kursk offensive would advance or retreat not only because of tactics and firepower, but because of what their commanders believed about enemy capabilities and intentions. And that belief, shaped by intelligence, would prove catastrophically incomplete on the German side, while the Soviets would possess an almost supernatural clarity about what was coming. The German intelligence apparatus in 1943 bore the scars of previous miscalculations. The Foreign Army's East Division, directed by Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, attempted to construct an accurate picture of Soviet strength from fragmentary reports, prisoner interrogations, and radio intercept analysis. Gehlen himself was a capable officer, but he operated within structural constraints that distorted his assessments. German intelligence consistently underestimated Soviet industrial capacity, Soviet manpower reserves, and the sophistication of Soviet defensive planning. These were not mere technical failures, but reflected deeper assumptions embedded in Nazi ideology. German analysts believed the Soviet system was inherently brittle, prone to collapse under sufficient military pressure. They believed that Soviet soldiers fought because they were coerced, not because they possessed genuine commitment. They believed that one more breakthrough, one more decisive victory, would cause the entire Soviet structure to fracture. These beliefs had survived repeated encounters with evidence to the contrary, which is perhaps the surest sign that ideology had corrupted intelligence analysis beyond recovery. Gehlen's assessments in the spring of 1943 suggested that Soviet forces in the Kursk area numbered perhaps 1.9 million troops across all sectors. The actual figure approached more than 2 million. Gehlen estimated Soviet tank reserves at approximately 5,500. Soviet records suggest the presence of nearly 8,000 tanks and self-propelled guns in the Kursk region alone. These were not minor discrepancies. They represented a gap between German assumptions and Soviet reality so profound that when Operation Citadel commenced, German commanders were essentially marching into a battle whose scale they had fundamentally misconstrued. German planners knew the Soviets would defend. They did not truly comprehend that the Soviets would defend with a depth, density, and coordination that rendered previous German calculations obsolete. The Soviet intelligence picture was almost inverted. The Red Army's military intelligence apparatus, including the GRU and increasingly the NKVD, operated with penetrating advantage regarding German intentions. The source code named Lucy, a network of agents and sources with access to high-level German planning, provided Moscow with extraordinarily detailed information about German operational plans. Lucy's reporting remains partially obscured by Cold War secrecy even now, but the available evidence suggests that Soviet intelligence knew the outline of German strategy, the two-pronged assault from north and south, the targeted breakthrough at Kursk, the general time frame, with remarkable specificity. Other sources supplemented this picture. German officers and officials, some motivated by ideological opposition to the Nazi regime, some simply by the calculation that Soviet victory seemed inevitable, provided information to Soviet handlers. The Soviets intercepted and decrypted significant volumes of German radio communications. They had penetrated multiple levels of the German military hierarchy with human agents. By April and May of 1943, Soviet intelligence did not merely suspect that a German offensive was coming. They knew it with the kind of certainty that transforms strategic planning from guesswork into engineering. This intelligence advantage translated directly into concrete defensive preparations. Beginning in April, Soviet commanders received authorization and resources to construct what would become the most heavily fortified defensive position ever built up to that moment in history. The Kursk salient became a fortress. Soviet engineers and infantry battalions dug anti-tank ditches, constructed networks of firing positions, laid minefields of unprecedented density, and constructed multiple defensive belts running deeply backward from the front lines. The northern approaches to Kursk were defended by the Central Front under General Konstantin Rokossovsky, a commander whose strategic vision and tactical skill had grown steadily throughout the war. The southern approaches fell under the Voronezh Front, commanded by General Nikolai Vatutin. Both men knew what was coming and had time to prepare with resources that German planners had not anticipated they would possess. The defensive preparations reflected a fundamental evolution in Soviet military doctrine. The Red Army had learned through catastrophe and hard experience that offense consumed resources, casualties, and supplies at rates that even Soviet capacity could not sustain indefinitely. Defense in depth, by contrast, allowed the Soviet system to leverage its manufacturing advantage and manpower reserves with maximum efficiency. Behind the front lines were concentric rings of prepared positions, each defended by artillery, anti-tank guns, and infantry in mutually supporting defensive formations. Behind those were operational reserves, entire armies held back to counterattack when German forces had exhausted themselves against the defensive belts. The depth of the Soviet defensive preparations extended backward for more than 200 kilometers. German military doctrine, trained and refined through 5 years of warfare, assumed that defense could be breached by sufficiently concentrated firepower and bold maneuver. Soviet preparations in the Kursk salient represented a direct challenge to this assumption. The Germans would not be breaking through a line, they would be grinding forward against a depth. German intelligence failures extended beyond mere underestimation of quantities to a failure to comprehend qualitative changes in Soviet capability. The Soviets had developed new tank designs, including the T-34 with a more powerful gun and thicker armor, the heavy tank KV-85, and self-propelled gun platforms that offered protection and firepower in combinations that German anti-tank doctrine had not fully adapted to counter. Soviet anti-tank guns had been upgraded, and their deployment patterns around Kursk reflected lessons learned from previous German offensives. The Soviets had learned where German breakthroughs were most likely, and had concentrated defensive firepower accordingly. German intelligence reported these developments with varying degrees of accuracy, but the cumulative assessment remained one of underestimation. German officers knew that new Soviet weapons existed. They did not fully appreciate how densely these weapons would be deployed, or how effectively Soviet doctrine would integrate them into layered defensive schemes. The intelligence disparity also affected German command confidence and decision-making in ways that would resonate through the planning phase. Hitler himself remained skeptical about Operation Citadel, expressing doubts that the operation could succeed against the kind of preparations that German intelligence suspected the Soviets were undertaking. Hitler's hesitations were rooted partly in intuition and partly in intelligence assessments that suggested Soviet strength was greater than previous German estimates. Yet these same intelligence reports also suggested that delays in launching the operation would only allow Soviet preparations to deepen further. This created a paralysis at the highest levels of German command. Operations could not proceed with confidence because the Soviets were too strong. Yet delay would make the Soviets even stronger. This logical trap, which should have led to cancellation of the offensive entirely, instead led to endless postponements while planning continued. The Leibstandarte and other assault divisions received orders and counter-orders, advanced to positions and then withdrew, prepared and prepared again through the spring and early summer of 1943. The delays worked entirely to Soviet advantage. The German intelligence failure regarding Kursk also reflected a broader pattern in Nazi strategic thinking. German planners consistently believed that superior German military quality and doctrine could compensate for Soviet quantitative advantages. This belief had proven partially true in the early phases of Barbarossa, when German forces destroyed enormous quantities of Soviet equipment and manpower. But the Soviets replaced their losses and continued fighting. By 1943, German planners faced an opponent whose capacity to sustain casualties and rebuild formations approached infinity compared to German resources. Yet the fundamental German assumption that one more breakthrough, one more victory engineered through tactical excellence, could somehow alter the trajectory of the war, persisted. Intelligence estimates that contradicted this assumption were unconsciously minimized or reinterpreted to align with desired conclusions. This is perhaps the most dangerous form of intelligence failure, not the absence of information, but the distortion of information to match pre-existing expectations. Soviet intelligence, by contrast, served to reinforce accurate strategic comprehension. Soviet planners understood their own weaknesses. They knew that their soldiers had endured enormous casualties and that their reserves, though numerically vast, were not inexhaustible. They understood that Germany retained the capacity to achieve tactical brilliance even in defeat. What Soviet intelligence told them was exactly how much time they had to prepare, exactly where the Germans would strike, and approximately what forces would be deployed. This allowed Soviet planners to construct a defense that would not rely on mobile maneuver or counterattack, but rather on absorbing and withstanding the German assault through sheer depth, density, and discipline. The Soviet command understood that the Germans would break through the first line, probably the second, perhaps even strike deeply toward the third defensive belt. But somewhere in that defensive architecture, the Soviet preparation was so thorough that German momentum would exhaust itself. Soviet planning was predicated on absorbing the German offensive and then launching overwhelming counterattacks when German forces had lost coherence and reserves. As Operation Citadel entered its final planning phase in early July, the German High Command remained divided about success. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the German Southern Army Group commander, believed that the operation could succeed if launched with sufficient force and audacity. Other officers harbored doubts that persisted despite optimistic intelligence assessments. The Leibstandarte, assembled in their jump-off positions with tanks maintained to peak condition and troops briefed on their objectives, stood as the concrete expression of German determination. They would fight with the skill and dedication that had defined them since their earliest battles. But skill and dedication would operate within the constraint imposed by intelligence failure. The Leibstandarte would advance into defences more extensive, more densely manned, and more carefully prepared than German planners believed. The casualty ratios would prove worse than expected. The breakthrough would not come. And by mid-July, when Operation Citadel was abandoned, it would not be because German tactical performance had failed, but because the gap between German intelligence and Soviet reality had proven insurmountable. The intelligence war at Kursk ultimately revealed a fundamental asymmetry in the capabilities of the two belligerents as 1943 advanced. The Soviets possessed superior intelligence regarding German intentions and the capacity to translate that intelligence into concrete defensive preparations. The Germans, despite capable intelligence officers and sophisticated analytical methods, remained trapped in assumptions that distorted their interpretation of the information they possessed. When the two intelligence systems collided on the battlefield, it would not be tanks against tanks or guns against guns alone. It would be German assumptions meeting Soviet reality. And on that collision, the fate of the Leibstandarte and Operation Citadel would turn. In the spring of 1943, the German High Command faced a calculation that would define the fate of the Eastern Front. The Red Army had halted their advance after the winter counteroffensives, grinding to a stop before the German lines stretched across Ukraine and southern Russia. But this lull was not peace. It was pregnant with tension. Soviet forces occupied a massive salient, a bulge in the front lines centered on the city of Kursk, a geometric weakness that German planners believed they could exploit. From April onwards, as thaw turned frozen ground to mud and then to dry earth, German generals debated whether to strike at this salient or accept the defensive posture that geography had forced upon them. The decision would not come quickly. The process would be tortured by doubt, internal rivalries, and a hesitance that proved catastrophic. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein embodied the confidence of the German officer class. He commanded Army Group South, and he had convinced himself that an offensive into the Kursk salient could work. Manstein reasoned that if Northern Army Group attacked from above and Army Group South attacked from below, the two German forces could close around the Soviet forces trapped inside the bulge, destroying them through encirclement. He had gambled successfully before, on smaller scales. He believed in maneuver, in the superiority of German tactical innovation, and in the fighting quality of his troops. The Leibstandarte, with their new armour and aggressive reputation, would anchor his southern thrust. The plan, which came to be known as Operation Citadel, seemed elegant on maps in headquarters. But elegance and feasibility are not the same thing. Adolf Hitler's mind moved differently. The Führer oscillated between enthusiasm and pessimism, between the ambitions of ideology and the constraints of material reality. By April 1943, Hitler had begun to grasp, however reluctantly, that Germany could not win the war in the traditional sense. The Soviet Union possessed reserves that seemed infinite. American industrial production was accelerating. The Western Allies were preparing to strike into Europe. Yet Hitler could not simply accept stalemate. He needed a victory, some confirmation that his strategy retained viability, some proof that German arms could still dominate the battlefield. Operation Citadel appealed to this need. It offered the promise of a decisive blow, a restoration of momentum that had been lost at the gates of Moscow and around Stalingrad. But as officers presented the plan, as logistical requirements multiplied, as estimates of Soviet strength accumulated on his desk, Hitler's resolve weakened. The first problem was timing. In the warm months of spring and summer, German forces could maneuver with greater speed, and tanks could cross terrain more easily than in the frozen winter. But spring also meant that the Soviets had time to prepare. and the Soviets, having broken the German army before Moscow and in the Caucasus, were not idle. They were already fortifying the Kursk salient, with a ferocity that German intelligence could observe but not fully quantify. Every week of delay gave the Soviets another week to dig trenches, to lay mines, to position anti-tank guns, to move reserves into place. General Kurt Zeitzler, the chief of the Army General Staff, urged Hitler to move quickly, to strike before Soviet preparations became insurmountable. But quickly and May collided with production schedules. New tanks were promised. The Panther tank, with its powerful gun and thicker armor, was supposed to enter service in numbers. The massive Tiger II, even more formidable, was in development. Hitler convinced himself that if he waited just a few more weeks, these new weapons would be available in sufficient quantity to guarantee success. Disagreement festered within the officer corps itself. General Hermann Hoth, commanding the 4th Panzer Army, supported Manstein's plan and believed the offensive could succeed if conducted decisively. But others harbored doubts. General Walter Model, commanding 9th Army in the north, believed that the Soviets had already detected the planned offensive through their intelligence networks. Model possessed a more skeptical cast of mind than Manstein. He had studied the Soviets and developed respect for their capacity to absorb punishment and reorganize. Model argued that by the time German forces attacked, the Soviets would have built defenses so dense and deep that breakthrough would require sacrifices that Germany could not afford. The German army was no longer a force capable of replacing casualties at the rate they were being inflicted. Every tank destroyed was a tank not rebuilt. Every experienced soldier killed could not be replaced with equivalent training and judgment. Model's pessimism was not defeatism. It was realism grounded in mathematics. The intelligence picture that reached Hitler's headquarters was ambiguous and fragmentary. German reconnaissance confirmed that the Soviets were fortifying the salient, but the true scale of their preparations remained obscure. The Lucy spy ring, a Soviet intelligence asset operating within Switzerland, was transmitting accurate information about German plans to Moscow. The Soviets knew not only that an offensive was being prepared, but possessed details about timing, objectives, and the units that would participate. Soviet intelligence could thus tailor their defenses, position their reserves, and prepare counter-offensives with precision that German planners had not encountered before. But this advantage belonged to the Soviets. German intelligence officers lacked similar penetration into Soviet planning. They could see movement, count vehicles, estimate troop positions. They could not see into the Soviet mind with the clarity they needed. They could not know how many defensive lines the Soviets had prepared or how many reserves they were moving into position. In this information vacuum, optimists like Manstein filled the space with confidence. Skeptics like Model filled it with dread. As April turned to May, and May edged toward June, Hitler postponed. Again and again, the offensive was scheduled and then delayed. The reasons accumulated. New tank deliveries were running late. Better weather could be waited for. One more week might bring more Panthers and Tigers into service. With each postponement, Hitler was giving the Soviets exactly what they did not want him to give them: time. The Soviets were not passive during this interval. Their engineers worked ceaselessly. Their factories produced anti-tank guns at rates that German planners had considered impossible. Soviet generals moved reinforcements into the salient, building defensive belts that extended dozens of kilometers deep into the earth. By June, the Kursk salient had become not a pocket of weakness, but a fortress. And Hitler still delayed. He could not bring himself to commit fully to Manstein's plan, nor could he abandon it without losing face. The result was a prolonged hesitation that became its own form of strategic defeat. The postponements also created another insidious effect: uncertainty among the troops. Officers and men sensed that the offensive was coming, but the constant delays eroded morale. Units assembled, checked their equipment, prepared for attack, and then waited. The psychological toll of repeated preparation, followed by cancellation, wore on soldiers. Veterans understood what the delays meant. Each passing week meant more Soviet defenses, fewer German surprises, and lower chances of success. Younger soldiers felt the tension of pending combat without the release of action. Officers in the Leibstandarte received new equipment, new tactics for dealing with Soviet defenses, new explanations for why success was certain. But repeated postponements whispered doubt more eloquently than any formal briefing could convey. The soldiers understood that they were being sent into prepared positions against an enemy who had been granted time to prepare. This knowledge did not destroy morale entirely. Professional soldiers are trained to execute orders regardless of their assessment of likely success, but it created a layer of grim resignation beneath the surface of military discipline. The German High Command was also confronted with strategic complications that extended beyond the Kursk salient. In the North Africa campaign, German and Italian forces had collapsed, and the Allies were preparing to move into Sicily and then mainland Europe. In the Atlantic, German U-boats were losing the submarine war against Allied convoy escorts. The Air Force was losing fighters faster than they could be replaced, as the Allies intensified bombing campaigns against German cities and industrial targets. Hitler could not ignore these theaters. Even as resources were being concentrated for Citadel, some had to be diverted to other fronts. The Leibstandarte themselves represented a commitment of elite troops and the finest equipment available, but they could not be deployed everywhere simultaneously. The question that haunted the High Command was whether Citadel represented the best use of these dwindling resources, or whether it was a gamble that, if it failed, would leave Germany strategically exhausted at the very moment when threats were multiplying. Manstein remained confident even as doubt accumulated around him. He argued that victory at Kursk would be more than a tactical success. It would restore German initiative, demonstrate that German arms could still defeat the Soviet army, even in the face of prepared defenses, and perhaps shock Stalin into negotiations. This argument had appeal. It offered a path out of the trap of total war. If Germany could convince Stalin that the cost of continuing the war would be unbearable, perhaps negotiations could follow. This reasoning was fantasy, but it was not baseless fantasy. It was grounded in a misunderstanding of Soviet determination and of Hitler's own negotiating position. The Soviets, having withstood the invasion of their territory and the destruction of their heartland, were not interested in negotiation. They sought victory and the elimination of the Nazi regime, but Manstein could not see this clearly. He could only see his own operational plan, its internal logic, its elegant geometry on the map. He could not see that the Soviets had already moved beyond the point where a single battlefield defeat could alter their strategic calculus. On the 5th of June 1943, Hitler finally committed. Operation Citadel was scheduled to begin on the 9th of July. This date was not random. By mid-June, enough new tanks had arrived to give Hitler confidence that his new weapons would provide the margin of superiority that his generals required. The Leibstandarte would receive these weapons and begin final preparations for the assault. But the decision to commit was made in the full knowledge that the Soviets had been preparing for weeks. German intelligence reports detailed increasing Soviet fortifications, but Hitler chose not to see in these reports a warning. Instead, he saw in them an argument for why speed and decisiveness would matter even more. If the Soviets were in fact preparing deep defenses, then German forces must break through quickly before those defenses became truly impenetrable. This reasoning was logical but mistaken. It assumed that will and boldness could overcome defensive depth. It assumed that the Leibstandarte and other German forces possessed the reserves of manpower and material to absorb the casualties that breakthrough would require. These assumptions would be tested on the steppe. The postponements from April through June 1943 represented a fatal delay for German strategy in the East. Hitler and Manstein had convinced themselves that Operation Citadel could succeed, that German tactical superiority and new weapons would overcome Soviet numerical superiority and prepared defenses. They were not wrong in believing that German soldiers could fight with skill and courage. The Leibstandarte would demonstrate precisely this courage when the moment came. But they were catastrophically wrong in believing that courage and skill could overcome the structural imbalances that now defined the war in the East. The Soviets had time, production capacity, manpower reserves, and strategic depth. Germany had none of these things in sufficient quantity. By postponing from April through June, Hitler had given the Soviets something they needed more than anything else: another month of preparation. The elegance of Manstein's plan would meet its test against the reality of Soviet preparation and Soviet determination. While German planners debated and postponed, the Soviet High Command transformed the landscape around Kursk into something the world had never seen before. The salient, that bulge of territory that had formed when German and Soviet forces faced off in the spring of 1943, became the focal point of an unprecedented defensive effort. Soviet commanders knew the attack was coming. Their intelligence networks, particularly the Lucy spy ring operating from Switzerland, had provided Hitler's operational plans weeks in advance. This was not guesswork or intuition. The Soviets possessed the actual German orders, the timing, the objectives, even the unit assignments. With this knowledge came an opportunity no military power had ever fully exploited: the chance to prepare defenses in anticipation of an enemy's precise offensive design. The architect of this Soviet preparation was Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the ruthless and brilliant chief of the Soviet General Staff, working alongside General Alexander Vasilevsky and the front commanders Konstantin Rokossovsky to the north and Ivan Konev to the south. Their vision transcended conventional defensive thinking, where traditional doctrine called for a single main defensive line. They ordered the construction of multiple belts, each one deeper and more lethal than the last. These were not hastily dug entrenchments. These were engineered systems of annihilation, calculated to turn the advance into a meat grinder. The first defensive belt, closest to the front line, was designed not to hold indefinitely, but to disrupt and attenuate the German assault. The second belt, several kilometers behind, was positioned to catch German forces when their momentum had slowed and their formations had begun to fragment. Behind that came third, fourth, and sometimes fifth belts, each stacked with reserves, each capable of independent resistance if needed. The numbers alone conveyed the scale of Soviet determination. Soviet engineers and combat soldiers worked through the spring and early summer of 1943, moving earth and stone on a continental scale. They established anti-tank gun positions at densities the Germans had never encountered. Where conventional wisdom suggested spreading defensive firepower along a line to maximize coverage, the Soviets clustered anti-tank guns in concentrated strongpoints, creating overlapping fields of fire designed to cripple German armor in crossfire. In some sectors, anti-tank gun density reached one gun for every 30 or 40 meters of front. To the Western Allies, such concentrations would have seemed extravagant, wasteful even. The Soviet approach was fundamentally different. Quantity as quality. Overwhelming force applied at precise points to ensure enemy destruction. They positioned more than 1 million anti-tank rifles, crude but effective weapons that Soviet infantry could deploy in numbers no other army could match. They sowed mines across the landscape at a scale that seemed almost incomprehensible. Millions of mines, anti-tank and anti-personnel, laid in geometric patterns designed to channel German vehicles into predetermined killing zones. The defensive zone did not exist in isolation. Behind the fortified belts lay vast reserves of manpower, the steppe front under Marshal Ivan Konev, containing fresh Soviet armies held back specifically to counterattack if the main defensive lines bent under German pressure. These were not hastily assembled conscripts. They were seasoned veterans, equipped with modern armor and artillery, positioned to exploit any German breakthrough and transform tactical success into strategic disaster. The psychological dimension of these preparations cannot be overlooked. Soviet troops working on fortifications understood they were not there to retreat. They were there to stand, to bleed, and if necessary to die. Every shovel of earth, every mine buried, every anti-tank gun emplaced sent the message that the next assault on Soviet soil would face something fundamentally different from the chaos of 1941. Soviet defensive doctrine had evolved through bitter experience. Early in the war, the Soviets had learned that linear defense, a single continuous line of fortifications, could be pierced by concentrated German assault and could not adapt to breakthroughs. The German invasions of 1941 had shattered the Stalin line precisely because it was linear and rigid. Kursk would demonstrate a different philosophy, defense in depth. The concept was not new. Military theorists had discussed it for decades, but the Soviets were about to execute it at a scale and with a sophistication that would establish new standards for defensive warfare. Multiple defensive belts meant that each penetration, each German tactical victory, would be absorbed into a larger system that remained intact and capable of response. A breakthrough at one point would not unravel the entire defense. Instead, it would simply trigger the engagement of deeper reserves and secondary lines. The German assault would face not a single moment of truth but a succession of increasingly costly trials. The engineers themselves became key figures in this Soviet effort. Under pressure to complete the fortifications before the German attack commenced, they worked around the clock during the months of April, May, and June. They dug anti-tank ditches wide enough and deep enough to trap German vehicles. They constructed reinforced concrete pillboxes at critical intersections. They strung barbed wire in multiple belts, each one a minor obstacle that would slow infantry, disrupt formations, and concentrate men in killing zones where Soviet machine gunners waited. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. Soviet workers, soldiers, and conscripted civilians, drawn from collective farms and factories across southern Russia, toiled under conditions that ranged from mud and cold to heat and dust. There were no air-conditioned rest areas, no hot meals delivered on schedule, no elaborate support systems. Thousands died during the preparation phase, victims of accidents, disease, exhaustion, and sporadic German air attacks against the fortification zones. These casualties were never celebrated, rarely documented. They were simply part of the cost. The artillery situation reflected the Soviet commitment to numerical superiority. Across the Kursk sector, the Red Army concentrated unprecedented quantities of field guns, howitzers, and heavy mortars. Soviet artillery doctrine had always emphasized mass firepower, but by 1943, with access to captured German weapons, American Lend-Lease equipment, and their own expanding production, the Soviets could organize artillery at densities that overwhelmed German calculations. Where German officers expected to suppress enemy artillery through superior gunnery and discipline, they would encounter not a few defensive batteries, but endless successive waves of fire that no amount of counter-battery work could fully suppress. The Soviets understood that in modern warfare, the side that could deliver more shells, more bullets, and more explosive force would ultimately prevail if the other side could not maneuver around that firepower. Tank reserves provided another dimension to Soviet defensive preparation. Soviet commanders had learned that armor could not be wasted in static positions, used as pillboxes along linear defenses. Instead, they positioned their tank units behind the main defensive belts, ready to respond to German breakthroughs with counterattacks that could cripple disorganized assault forces. These tank reserves were not scattered, but concentrated into coherent mechanized reserves capable of delivering focused blows against German spearheads. The tanks themselves, Soviet T-34 and other models, had been steadily improved through 1943, and while still not a match for the newest German Tigers on a one-to-one basis, they offered Soviet commanders something invaluable: numbers. For every Tiger the Germans could field, the Soviets could deploy 20 T-34s, and if German armor was tied down suppressing one Soviet tank, 10 more could bypass it and attack German supply lines or less defended positions. The psychological preparation of Soviet troops matched the physical fortification. Soviet propaganda, for all its crudeness by later standards, effectively communicated to soldiers that this offensive would be different from the chaos and catastrophe of 1941. The Soviets would not be defending their homeland in desperate, improvised circumstances. They would be fighting from prepared positions behind their own defenses. Soviet soldiers were shown the fortifications. They were briefed on the planned reserves. They were told repeatedly that German invasion would be blunted and thrown back. This was not abstract reassurance. It was grounded in visible reality. The trenches they had dug, the guns they had positioned, the endless supply convoys moving supplies forward. Trust in leadership, which had been fractured by earlier disasters, began to rebuild itself. The Soviet command structure itself reflected the seriousness with which the operation was approached. Zhukov, Vasilevsky, and the front commanders possessed authority to make immediate decisions without constant reference back to Stalin and Moscow. Chain of command was clear, and responsibilities were explicit. Where the German high command was becoming tangled in Hitler's increasingly desperate last-minute adjustments and strategic uncertainties, the Soviet command system was streamlined and focused. Orders flowed from the high command through fronts and armies to divisions with clarity. This efficiency in command, married to overwhelming firepower and carefully prepared defenses, created a system that was genuinely formidable. By late June 1943, the Soviet defensive zone around Kursk had become perhaps the most heavily fortified area on the entire Eastern Front, perhaps more heavily fortified than any comparable area anywhere on Earth at that moment. Millions of soldiers stood in or behind these positions, supported by thousands of guns, hundreds of thousands of mines, and vast reserves positioned to react to German movement. The German planners who had postponed Operation Citadel repeatedly, thinking each delay brought better conditions, could not have been more mistaken. Every week of delay had given the Soviets another week to fortify, another week to stockpile ammunition, another week to position reserves, another week to integrate new equipment. What had begun as a German operational concept, a pincer movement intended to encircle and destroy Soviet armies through shock and speed, had gradually transformed into something entirely different. It had become, by the time German forces finally advanced on the 5th of July, an attempt to break through the most formidable defensive system anyone had yet constructed, defended by men who knew the attack was coming, who had time to prepare, and who would not break. The summer of 1943 arrived with a quality of light that seemed incongruous with the weight of what was coming. Across the rolling steppes south of Kursk, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler began its final assembly for what would prove the largest tank engagement in human history. Men who had fought in Poland, France, and across the vast expanses of Russia now gathered in carefully concealed staging areas, hidden beneath camouflage netting and dispersed across ravines and wooded positions to evade Soviet reconnaissance aircraft. The division had grown lean through years of continuous combat, but what remained possessed a coherence born from shared sacrifice and the unspoken understanding that they represented something different from ordinary Wehrmacht formations. Officers moved between positions with clipboards and maps, conducting final briefings while junior leaders cross-checked ammunition loads, fuel allocations, and the mechanical condition of tanks and half-tracks. The atmosphere carried an electric quality, not of confidence as it might have years before, but of professional soldiers steeling themselves for an undertaking whose scale they could barely comprehend. The Leibstandarte that assembled in those late June days bore the physical marks of 4 years of continuous warfare. The division numbered roughly 20,000 men across 3 Panzer Grenadier regiments, supported by tank companies and assault gun platoons, equipped with the latest German armour available to them. Many wore the panzer tunic, despite the summer heat, the black fabric stained with dried mud and bleached by prolonged exposure to sun. Scars marked them visibly. Men with healed wounds who had returned from hospital, others with burns that had left their faces perpetually reddened, amputees functioning in support roles or assigned to garrison duties far from the front. The officer corps remained dominated by men in their late 30s to early 40s, experienced professionals who had navigated the catastrophic progression from victory through stalemate to mounting defeat. They understood the mathematics of attrition better than anyone. They had seen units like their own bleed themselves empty against immovable resistance. Yet discipline held firm, because discipline was what the Leibstandarte had always possessed above all other qualities. When orders came down, men responded without visible hesitation. The equipment they would carry into battle represented the technological peak available to German armoured forces at that moment, yet already it bore the weight of obsolescence. The Panther tanks arriving in increasing numbers represented a genuine response to Soviet T-34 designs, offering superior armour protection and a more powerful gun than the earlier Panzer IVs that still comprised much of the division's tank strength. These vehicles embodied months of engineering work and represented resources committed to the Eastern Front that Germany could never adequately replenish. Each tank lost meant weeks of manufacturing time to replace it, months if replacement parts had to be improvised or cannibalized from other damaged vehicles. Men who worked in the motor pools and maintenance sections understood this intimately. They approached each vehicle with meticulous care, checking suspension components, ensuring hydraulic systems functioned properly, and test-firing weapons to ensure zero adjustment. The newer anti-tank rifles and portable Panzerfausts, distributed to infantry squads, represented another generation of desperation, weapons designed to be used at suicidally close range against Soviet armour, because range advantage had already shifted irreversibly toward the enemy. Every piece of equipment carried within it both promise and admission of limitation. Ammunition dumps sprawled across concealed locations throughout the staging areas, organized with the precision that only paranoid caution could generate. High explosive rounds for the divisional artillery, anti-tank ammunition sorted by type and stored in carefully ventilated bunkers, belted ammunition for machine guns arranged in canvas carriers. Everything arranged according to exacting specifications developed through hard experience. Supply officers conducted count after count, aware that nothing remained worse than running short during an offensive. Officers responsible for logistics moved between positions with the grim focus of men whose failures would translate directly into comrade deaths. The transport capacity had been calculated down to individual vehicle loads, routes planned to minimize exposure to air attack, resupply schedules organized around estimated consumption rates that everyone understood would likely prove far too conservative. The Luftwaffe had promised air cover, but no one within the Leibstandarte truly believed those promises anymore. Air superiority had departed the Eastern Front in 1942 and never returned. Soviet aircraft operated with increasing freedom, and the few German fighters allocated to support this sector could only be in one place at one time. Water discipline became its own obsession during those final days before deployment to forward positions. June heat had turned the steppes into an expanse of dust and reflected brightness, the kind of environment that exhausted men faster than combat did. Officers reminded soldiers repeatedly that water discipline meant survival, that casualties to heat exhaustion represented waste as surely as casualties to enemy fire. Trucks carrying water arrived on careful schedules, and men filled their canteens from communal points, careful never to waste a drop. This was another thing that distinguished the Leibstandarte from lesser units. Their understanding that logistics were not abstract supply chain management, but direct prerequisites for staying alive. A soldier who dehydrated became useless within hours. A unit that ran short of water broke apart from within before any enemy shot mattered. The medical sections distributed salt tablets and conducted lectures on heat casualty prevention that men had heard before but needed to hear again. These routines of preparation extended beyond mere equipment and ammunition into the realm of physical and psychological conditioning, as if repetition itself could somehow ward off the catastrophe that everyone sensed but could not voice. Officers conducted final map briefings in designated command posts, camouflaged beneath screens of branches and canvas. The maps showed the Soviet defensive positions in impressive detail, or as much detail as German intelligence could provide. Multiple defensive lines appeared as contours of fortification, anti-tank gun positions marked with careful precision, infantry strongpoints indicated by symbols that represented thousands of men and incalculable quantities of weapons dug into the earth. The briefing officers explained the objectives in measured tones that carried no sense of doubt, because doubt was not permitted. The breakthrough would occur here and here and here. The follow-on exploitation would proceed along these axes. Division would advance roughly 50 kilometers in the initial phase, establishing themselves in positions from which further operations would unfold. The plans possessed the clarity that comes from meticulous German staff work, which was precisely the problem. The plans could be meticulous and accurate without being achievable. Officers who had fought on the Russian front knew this, but said nothing. The chain of command extended upward to Hitler himself, and the Führer had decreed that this offensive would proceed. Lower officers accepted orders and made their preparations accordingly. The men themselves occupied the peculiar mental space of soldiers awaiting combat they understood would be different in scale from anything they had previously encountered. Conversations in small groups touched on practical concerns, checking equipment, discussing rumors about the offensive's objectives, wondering aloud whether the Soviets truly had as many defensive lines as intelligence reported. Some wrote letters home that they suspected might be their last. though this recognition remained unspoken. Others focused obsessively on physical preparation, cleaning weapons repeatedly, running through loading and firing sequences in their minds, rehearsing the movements they would execute when armored vehicles came under fire. The psychological condition occupied a narrow band between sufficient tension to maintain alertness and the kind of paralytic fear that destroyed effectiveness. Experienced soldiers developed mental techniques to navigate this space. They focused on immediate tasks rather than abstract outcomes. They maintained routines that provided structure and purpose to the waiting. They drew strength from the cohesion of their units, from men they had survived with through years of combat. The ideological fervor that had once animated the Leibstandarte remained present in traces, but the primary motivation now was simply not to die and not to allow their comrades to die unnecessarily. The division's history hung over this moment in ways both men and officers recognized without explicit acknowledgement. The Leibstandarte had been created as elite, selected, indoctrinated, and shaped through years of careful cultivation into something supposedly different from ordinary soldiers. Yet the war had systematized and democratized them through the sheer grinding force of continuous casualties and replacement. New men arrived regularly from training depots, and integration into the division took weeks at best. The unit cohesion that remained derived less from special selection than from shared survival. Officers who had led men through the desperate retreat before Moscow, through the frozen battles of 1942, through mounting chaos on the Eastern Front, understood that their soldiers possessed abilities born from experience rather than from any special quality of recruitment or ideology. This knowledge carried implications that no one in the high command seemed willing to fully accept. If the Leibstandarte possessed no supernatural advantage, if their soldiers were ultimately subject to the same limitations as all other men, then their presence in this offensive changed nothing fundamental about the strategic equation. They would fight superbly. They would advance further than ordinary units might advance. They would inflict casualties at ratios more favorable than average. And none of that would necessarily prove sufficient to achieve the offensive's ultimate objectives. By the last days of June, the entire division had assumed its assault positions south of Kursk, still masked from direct Soviet observation, but close enough that the reality of what awaited them became visceral and immediate. Some men caught glimpses of the Soviet defensive positions in the distance. Earthen berms, anti-tank ditches, occasional flashes of metal that might have been armor or might have been gun barrels. The terrain ahead offered few advantages to attackers. The landscape rolled gently, which meant cover existed in scattered quantities, but no position offered comprehensive concealment. Every meter of advance would be observable from Soviet positions. Every vehicle that moved would draw fire from weapons whose characteristics German soldiers understood intimately from years of fighting Soviet equipment. The intelligence briefings mentioned that the Soviets had committed forces on a scale that German planners apparently believed the Kursk offensive could overcome through tactical brilliance and willpower. No one in the Leibstandarte found this assessment particularly reassuring. Final equipment distributions occurred on the 2nd and 3rd of July, with ammunition, fuel, and specialized assault equipment allocated down to squad level. Men received new uniforms where replacements were available, though many retained the worn items they had maintained themselves. Officers inspected units with attention to detail that bordered on obsessive, weapons cleaned, ammunition properly distributed, medical supplies secured against loss during movement. This was the final checkpoint where anything obviously broken or malfunctioning could still be addressed before commitment to combat. After this point, soldiers would work with whatever they possessed, improvising solutions to problems that emerged from the chaos of battle. Chaplains from various denominations conducted brief services that remained theologically minimal because theology seemed almost frivolous against the magnitude of what awaited. Some men attended these services seeking spiritual fortification. Others remained in their positions, maintaining their weapons or sitting in small groups with comrades who had shared survival through too many campaigns to require words. The night of the 4th of July passed slowly for most soldiers, filled with the kind of wakefulness that combat veterans had learned to manage without actual sleep. Officers moved through positions one final time, confirming that units understood their assignments, checking ammunition allocations once more, ensuring that everyone comprehended the sequence of objectives for the coming offensive. Radio operators tested communications gear repeatedly, establishing that frequencies remained clear and that signal procedures functioned properly. Tank commanders verified that their crews understood the planned axis of advance and had memorized landmarks that would serve as navigation references once the offensive became a confused mass of movement and fire. Artillery officers conducted final checks on fire support plans that had been developed in conjunction with regimental commanders. The systematic nature of these preparations represented the accumulated experience of a military organization that had learned through blood and defeat that thorough planning translated directly into survival probabilities. Every detail that could be addressed in advance meant one less detail requiring improvisation under fire. As dawn approached on the 5th of July, the Leibstandarte assumed final attack positions. Vehicle crews aboard their tanks and half-tracks, infantry packed into armored personnel carriers, artillery crews standing beside their guns awaiting fire commands. The summer heat already announced itself through the pre-dawn darkness, promising another brutal day of exposure. Men checked their watches, synchronized to precise divisional timings, and waited for the moment when the artillery would commence fire and the offensive would begin. The tension at this point transcended normal combat anticipation. This was not a local attack or a limited operation. Intelligence suggested that Soviet forces committed to defend Kursk might outnumber German attackers by ratios that bordered on the incomprehensible. The defensive preparations visible to everyone meant that this would not be a rapid exploitation through broken enemy formations. This would be a grinding, methodical assault against prepared positions, defended by soldiers who had spent weeks preparing to resist exactly this kind of offensive. Yet training and discipline held firm. Orders were clear. The mission had been defined. In a few hours, everything theoretical would convert to practical, and the Leibstandarte would learn whether their legend could survive collision with the largest defensive undertaking the Red Army had yet constructed. Before dawn on the 5th of July 1943, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler occupied their assault positions south of Kursk. For weeks, soldiers had waited in staging areas, servicing tanks, cleaning weapons, reviewing maps that showed them the Soviet positions they would assault. Command tents glowed with the final briefings. Officers spoke with controlled confidence born from years of training and previous victories. The men listened, understanding that this would be different from Poland or France. This was the Soviet Union, where blitzkrieg had already been tested and found insufficient. But orders were orders, and the Leibstandarte did not question. They prepared their equipment, wrote letters they might not send, and tried to find sleep in the humid summer darkness. Somewhere behind them, artillery pieces stretched across kilometers of open ground, their barrels already loaded with shells that waited only for the command to fire. The artillery preparation began at 0430 hours. The darkness erupted into a world of flame and noise, so overwhelming that men who had survived years of combat could scarcely process the magnitude. Thousands of guns, from light field pieces to heavy howitzers, opened fire simultaneously against the Soviet positions north and south of the Kursk salient. The ground itself seemed to shake. Soviet observers in their trenches and bunkers heard the approaching roar like an avalanche, and they braced for the impact. German engineers had calculated the bombardment to suppress enemy positions, kill entrenched troops, and damage the fortifications that intelligence reports had identified. What German planners could not suppress through firepower alone would be overwhelmed by the speed and concentration of the mechanized assault. Or so the theory stood. The reality would prove far more resistant to optimization. The Soviet defensive network around Kursk was unlike anything the German army had previously encountered. The Soviets had 5 full defensive belts in the southern sector, some stretching 6 kilometers deep. Each belt contained interconnected trenches, anti-tank gun positions arranged in depth, mines sown in patterns calculated to funnel attacking vehicles into kill zones, and concrete bunkers linked by communication trenches. The Soviets had constructed more than 400,000 anti-tank obstacles, including steel rails welded together and tank traps. Anti-tank guns numbered in the thousands, concentrated specifically to defeat massed German armor. Machine gun nests commanded approach routes. Mortar and artillery positions sat behind the forward defenses, protected and coordinated through primitive but functional telephone and runner systems. Stalin and his high command had decided that the Kursk salient would break the myth of German offensive superiority. They had invested 5 months of continuous preparation, multiple armies, and industrial production at unprecedented levels to create a defensive posture that would absorb and destroy any attacker. As dawn broke, the Leibstandarte advanced. The first wave of assault troops moved forward behind their tanks, clearing mines and probing for the exact locations of Soviet anti-tank guns. The Panther tanks and Panzer IVs that had been so effective in previous campaigns now encountered Soviet defenses that specifically anticipated their arrival. The Soviets had studied German tank tactics, understood the limitations of German armor, and positioned anti-tank guns not in isolation, but in mutually supporting clusters that would force German armor into devastating crossfire. The Mark IV, which had dominated battlefields in France and North Africa, had only modest armor compared to the emerging Soviet T-34. The Panther, Germany's newest medium tank with superior sloping armor, was being committed to its first major battle. But tanks alone could not break through prepared defenses when anti-tank guns were positioned with the explicit purpose of destroying them. The Leibstandarte's mechanized infantry advanced in wave after wave, seeking to infiltrate through gaps, seize critical strongpoints, and clear enough ground for the armor to consolidate. For hours, the battle maintained a pattern. German units would identify a weak point in the Soviet line, concentrate forces there, overwhelm local defenders through firepower, and gain ground. Then Soviet reserves would counterattack, and the Germans would consolidate their positions, regroup, and prepare the next assault. The casualty rate climbed with each phase. Soviet anti-tank rifles, crewed by soldiers lying in shell craters, could penetrate German vehicles at close range. The Molotov cocktails, crude improvised incendiary devices, appeared in Soviet hands with increasing frequency. Soviet artillery, which had been largely silent during the initial bombardment because it was positioned deeper in the defensive belts, now opened fire on German assembly areas and approach routes. German signals officers reported difficulty maintaining communications as the Soviet artillery damaged telephone lines and radio nets became congested with reports of casualties and requests for reinforcement. By mid-morning on the 5th of July, the momentum of the German assault had begun to slow. The first defensive belt had been breached in several locations, but the breaches were narrow and contested. Soviet reserves were arriving, fed through reserve communication trenches and moved to counterattack positions. The Leibstandarte's commanding officers had expected to drive through the first belt in the opening hours and establish momentum for the subsequent advance. Instead, they were fighting house to house in destroyed villages, clearing trenches with grenades, and accounting for casualties that already exceeded preliminary estimates. The ground was becoming a vision of industrial warfare. Smoke, dust, the roar of engines and explosions, soldiers taking cover behind wrecked buildings and abandoned vehicles, medics working frantically on wounded men with injuries that overwhelmed medical capacity. The Leibstandarte threw armor into the fighting with increasing frequency. Panzer formations that were meant to exploit breakthroughs now found themselves committed piecemeal to support infantry that was meeting far stiffer resistance than anticipated. German tanks would drive forward, locate Soviet anti-tank guns, engage them, but often fall victim to additional guns positioned in depth that the initial engagement had not revealed. The loss of Panther tanks, irreplaceable because German industry could not produce them in the quantity needed, represented a strategic hemorrhage. Each German tank lost was replaced by none. Each Soviet T-34 or anti-tank gun destroyed was succeeded by another held in reserve. This was the mathematics that German planners had been warned about but could not accept. Soviet production exceeded German production by margins that grew wider each month. Soviet mobilization capacity, drawing from a population larger than the Reich's, meant that reserves could be fed into battle with apparent inexhaustibility. The second defensive belt came into view by late afternoon of the 5th of July. The Leibstandarte had advanced perhaps 8 kilometers, a significant tactical accomplishment that would have been a triumph in previous campaigns, but they had consumed ammunition at rates that supply lines struggled to replace, suffered casualties that exceeded replacement schedules, and lost irreplaceable equipment to anti-tank fires. The second belt was constructed with the same methodical preparation as the first: trenches, bunkers, anti-tank positions, minefields. Behind it lay the third belt, and behind that the fourth and fifth. Soviet Stavka, the High Command, had created a defensive posture that accepted the loss of front-line positions while funneling German forces into zones of concentrated fire. The deeper the German advance, the more concentrated the defensive fires became. Soviet doctrine had shifted from attempting to defend in a rigid line to accepting tactical retreats while maintaining the overall integrity of the defensive posture. When local positions became untenable, Soviet troops withdrew to the next line in organized fashion, preserving themselves for the next engagement. The Leibstandarte's assault was supposed to achieve breakthrough by the end of the first day. The strategic plan required rapid exploitation to prevent Soviet reserves from arriving at critical points. But by nightfall on the 5th of July, the Leibstandarte was barely halfway through the first belt in some sectors and facing the second belt in others. The sun set on a battlefield crowded with wrecked vehicles, bodies, and the exhausted men of both armies digging in against the night. German officers recognized the problem immediately. They were fighting a battle of attrition on terrain that favored the defender, against an enemy that possessed greater reserves, and under time constraints that allowed the Soviets to receive additional reinforcements. The situation was the inverse of blitzkrieg. Instead of speed and shock overwhelming an unprepared enemy, the Germans faced a prepared enemy that had specifically designed their defenses to neutralize German tactical strengths. Throughout the night of the 5th to 6th of July, the battle continued with intensity that neither side could fully sustain. The Leibstandarte regrouped, received ammunition, and prepared for renewed assault at dawn. Replacement troops arrived to fill the gaps created by casualties. Artillery on both sides continued firing, consuming ammunition at prodigious rates. Soviet reserves moved forward under cover of darkness, positioning themselves for counterattacks. The two armies, locked in proximity, could hear each other. The sound of tank engines, the shouting of orders, the groans of wounded men. This was industrial warfare stripped of all mythology, reduced to mathematics. German attacking force against Soviet defensive positions, German industrial capacity against Soviet industrial capacity, German manpower against Soviet manpower. All the calculations pointed in one direction, but neither army could acknowledge it while the battle continued. As the 6th of July dawned, the Leibstandarte renewed their assault with the same intensity as the first day, but with less hope. Officers understood by now that the brief that had promised breakthrough was obsolete. Instead, they were committed to a grinding attritional campaign where each 100 meters of advance cost men and machines that could not be easily replaced. The Soviet defensive belts, each more formidable than the last, loomed ahead. The casualty lists grew longer. The gap between German planning assumptions and operational reality had widened into a chasm. For the elite Leibstandarte, the moment of consequence had arrived, the moment when fanaticism and training encountered structural limits imposed by enemy preparedness, defensive technology, and sheer industrial weight. They would continue to advance, would accomplish tactical gains that their commanders would present as victories, but the strategic outcome was already visible to those who could read the mathematics. The breaking point approached. The 6th of July marked the transition from opening assault to grinding war of attrition. Behind the Leibstandarte, the first Soviet defensive belt lay breached, but not broken, its fortifications still smoking, its anti-tank guns silent, but their crews dead in the rubble. Ahead lay not open terrain for exploitation, but instead a second belt of prepared positions, equally formidable, equally defended by reserves that seemed to materialize from the earth itself. The realization began to settle over German officers that morning, like morning fog over the steppe. This would not be blitzkrieg. This would be something slower, bloodier, and far less certain of success. The artillery barrage that had preceded the breakthrough on the 5th was merely prologue. Now came the heavy machinery of sequential offense, where each defended position had to be overwhelmed, not through tactical brilliance, but through accumulated firepower and expendable bodies. The Leibstandarte's mechanized regiments pushed south toward Ponyri and the surrounding villages with tanks, assault guns, and motorized infantry in close coordination. The terrain itself became an enemy as significant as Soviet guns. The landscape beyond Kursk was a mosaic of gullies, ravines, and defilades that broke armor into isolated groups, that channeled vehicles into killing zones, that forced dismounted assault where tanks could not follow. Soviet anti-tank guns, positioned to cover these natural approaches, proved devastatingly effective. The German tankers and grenadiers discovered that initial momentum could not be sustained against defense in depth. Each Soviet trench system destroyed required house-to-house fighting that bled personnel. Each village that appeared cleared in the afternoon proved to contain fresh defenders by evening. Supply lines stretched thin across the lunar world of cratered Earth, making resupply increasingly desperate. Fuel consumption accelerated as engines labored through difficult terrain. Ammunition expenditure mounted as Soviet reserves were fed into battle continuously. By the 7th of July, the true character of the campaign crystallized. The Leibstandarte had advanced perhaps 10 to 15 kilometers from their starting positions, a distance that in France, in 1940, might have represented a satisfactory day's progress. Here it represented an enormous cost in casualties and material. Tank losses accumulated not just from enemy fire, but from mechanical breakdowns, from mines that German sappers struggled to clear fast enough, from the simple wearing out of overextended supply chains. The divisional commander faced a calculus that grew more punishing each hour. Invest more troops to exploit an advantage that diminished with every commitment, or accept that the breakthrough had merely cracked German into the first crust of an infinitely deep defense. Soviet reserves appeared in unexpected strength. Intelligence reports suggested that for every unit the Germans destroyed, 2 more emerged from reserve positions kilometers to the rear. The Soviets were not defending Kursk with their first line. They were defending it with first through fifth lines, with reserves behind those lines, and with reserves behind those reserves. German planners had anticipated this intellectually, but had not truly internalized it emotionally. The grinding continued through the 8th and 9th of July in increasingly desperate conditions. Tank companies that had begun the offensive at full strength were consolidated with losses after 3 days of continuous combat. The Leibstandarte's Panzer Regiment, which had opened the campaign with multiple operational tanks, found itself rationing serviceable armor. Breakdowns mounted as extreme usage and difficult terrain took their toll on engines, transmissions, and tracks. Recovery vehicles, themselves in limited supply, worked constantly to retrieve damaged armor before Soviet counterattacks could destroy it where it sat. Grenadier companies suffered even more visibly. Infantry assault across open ground in the face of coordinated Soviet defensive fire extracted a price that exceeded replacement capacity. Officers watched their companies shrink from 120 personnel to 80 to 60 to perhaps 40 within days. Replacements arrived sporadically and in insufficient numbers. The quality of replacements also declined, as the Wehrmacht now drew men from less rigorous training pipelines and from units scattered across occupied Europe. The men who had anchored the Leibstandarte's fearsome reputation through years of combat were being diluted by less experienced soldiers thrust into the most brutal conditions imaginable. Exhaustion, a silent enemy, began its work by the middle of the second week of combat. Soldiers in frontline positions experienced little more than fitful sleep for days at a time. Officers directing operations from command posts worked continuously, processing reports from below, coordinating with higher headquarters, managing the complex logistics of fuel, ammunition, and personnel replacement. Vehicles that might have been maintained with regularity could barely be cleaned, let alone properly serviced. Drivers who had not rested properly made navigation errors that cost vehicles and lives. Gunners in tanks, operating in stifling heat within armored hulls, began to lose the precision that had served them in earlier campaigns. Artillery crews hammered away at Soviet positions until barrels overheated and ammunition supplies dwindled. The Luftwaffe, committed in strength south of Kursk, flew sortie after sortie, but found Soviet air defenses stronger and more coordinated than German intelligence had predicted. Aircraft losses mounted without correspondent gains in air superiority. German pilots found that technological advantage in aircraft design meant less when facing superior numbers and well-coordinated anti-aircraft defense. The human cost became quantifiable by the 9th of July in casualty figures that alarmed even hardened commanders. The Leibstandarte's combat strength had declined precipitously. Divisions that entered the campaign with nominal strength of approximately 20,000 personnel were operating at perhaps 60% effectiveness by the end of the first week. Evacuated wounded had to traverse distances growing longer each day as the forward advance extended supply lines ever further. Medical facilities, designed for tactical mobility rather than surgical capacity, were overwhelmed. Surgeons worked in shifts that would have broken minds less hardened by years of war. Infections claimed lives that the initial wound itself might not have taken. Amputations became routine procedures. Infection control was a luxury in field hospitals where water supply was a constant crisis. Replacement soldiers arriving from Germany, indoctrinated with stories of the Leibstandarte's invincibility, discovered immediately that no ideological commitment could protect flesh against Soviet anti-tank guns or artillery. The psychological impact of these discoveries rippled through the formations. Soviet counterattacks intensified as the German offensive became increasingly predictable. Having absorbed the impact of initial German assault, the Soviet command committed reserves into the struggle with accelerating ferocity. Local counterattacks, aimed not at pushing Germans back, but at pinning them in place, at preventing reserves from being moved to critical breakthrough sectors, at forcing the Germans to spend ammunition and lives at rates exceeding their capacity to sustain. German officers recognized the pattern, but possessed limited options to counter it. Holding ground required troops. Advancing required more troops. Extracting troops from one sector to concentrate at another required abandoning territory and accepting tactical defeat in that area. The Leibstandarte found itself trapped in a spiral of reactive commitment, feeding units into the battle piecemeal as they became available, never achieving the critical concentration of force necessary for breakthrough. Even when German units achieved local tactical successes, capturing a village or breaking through a defensive line, they found themselves isolated, surrounded by Soviet reserves, unable to consolidate gains without reinforcement that was already committed elsewhere. By the 10th and 11th of July, the weather began to shift in ways that compounded tactical difficulties. Summer rains transformed the steppe into mud that immobilized tracked vehicles far more effectively than any Soviet anti-tank gun. Wheeled vehicles became completely bogged, their wheels churning uselessly in bottomless mud. Supply columns slowed to crawls measured in kilometers per hour. Artillery pieces had to be manhandled into positions by hand when their prime movers could not traverse the quagmire. Ammunition supplies contracted as trucks spent more time moving less tonnage. Fuel reserves dwindled as vehicles burned gasoline at rates far exceeding projections. The rain that should have slowed Soviet operations seemed somehow to accelerate them. Soviet mechanized units, operating from positions closer to their supply bases, seemed less affected. Soviet reserves, already concentrated in depth, moved forward with apparent inevitability. German mechanized troops, stretched across wider territory and dependent on longer supply lines, found themselves increasingly constrained by weather that favored defense and defensive positions over offensive maneuver. The psychological dimension of the struggle shifted perceptibly as the second week of July progressed. The narrative that had sustained German combat motivation through previous Eastern campaigns began to fray. The Leibstandarte had been victory machines in 1941, had turned back Soviet offensives in 1942, had recaptured Kharkov in 1943. Soldiers who had fought through these campaigns carried a mythology of invincibility, a belief that better training and ideological commitment would overcome material disadvantages. Kursk shattered that mythology. No amount of training overcame defending prepared positions from assault across open ground. No ideological commitment made bodies invisible to machine gun fire or artillery splinters. No tactical brilliance defeated an enemy that simply had more soldiers, more guns, and more time to prepare. Officers observed the change in their men. Soldiers still executed orders, still advanced when commanded, still held positions when required to hold them, but the aggressive spirit that had characterized even the most brutal fighting in earlier campaigns was absent. This was grim duty now, mechanistic and joyless. The gap between the Leibstandarte they had been and the Leibstandarte they were becoming widened visibly. Higher command circuits struggled with the fundamental question now hovering over the entire operation. Could breakthrough still be achieved? Some commanders remained optimistic, believing that one more concentrated push through the next defensive belt would crack Soviet resistance. Others argued for consolidation of the ground already taken, for a fighting defense that would bleed Soviet reserves and set conditions for future operations when conditions favored the Germans. Hitler, hundreds of kilometers to the rear, received reports that seemed designed to support whatever decision he might make. Field commanders in contact with reality faced increasingly desperate calculations: commit all remaining reserves to breakthrough, and risk being overwhelmed if the breakthrough failed to materialize. Hold positions and accept that the initiative had passed to the enemy. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. German casualties mounted while Soviet reserves apparently did not diminish. Territory gained came at rates measured in dead per kilometer of advance. No calculation made by German planners in the weeks before the offensive had accounted for attrition at these rates on both personnel and material. By the 12th of July, a threshold had been crossed that only high command could fully acknowledge. The Leibstandarte, still fighting, still advancing in places, had ceased to be the instrument of breakthrough that had been conceived. It was now a formation bleeding to death in slow motion, its remaining strength dissipating into the infinite defense of the Soviet position. Subordinate commanders could calculate from casualty reports and tank loss returns that within perhaps another week of continuous operations at current rates of attrition, their divisions would be combat ineffective. Personnel losses exceeded replacement capacity so dramatically that units were being consolidated, companies merged with other companies, platoons reformulated from remnants of multiple units. The cohesion that elite formations maintained through continuity of personnel and command was eroding. Armor was becoming scarce as tank losses piled up against a limited industrial production pipeline that could not match losses. Artillery ammunition reserves, vast at the campaign's opening, were being depleted at such rates that fire support would soon become episodic rather than continuous. The grinding war of attrition that the Soviets had designed the defense to produce was grinding exactly as the Soviets had planned. Time, numbers, and depth were consuming German offensive capability with inexorable mathematics that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. The human experience of those days of grinding warfare was one of repetition, exhaustion, and encroaching despair, masked by continued discipline. Soldiers woke in darkness to prepare for assaults they had conducted variations of every day for more than a week. Officers issued orders knowing that execution would cost personnel they could not replace. Supply officers juggled shortages of everything that sustained combat operations. Communications personnel relayed messages back to higher command, knowing that the answers they received would offer no relief. Ambulance crews worked in shifts so continuous they lost track of day and night, loading wounded onto vehicles bound for medical facilities already overwhelmed. Tank crews buttoned up in vehicles that had become tombs of sorts, operating inside metal boxes where any penetration by enemy fire meant death or permanent dismemberment. Infantry pressed forward across terrain that never seemed to change, each assault slightly different in detail, but identical in essential nature. Advance against prepared positions defended by men with every advantage of terrain, preparation, and reserves. The Leibstandarte was discovering that elite status meant nothing when confronted with overwhelming numbers, brilliant defensive design, and an enemy willing to pay whatever price was necessary to deny you victory. The breaking point was not yet reached on the 12th of July, but it was visible on the horizon, approaching with the certainty of Soviet reserves and the inevitability of superior numbers, finally overwhelming even the best trained and most fanatic soldiers the German Reich could field. While the Leibstandarte pushed south through successive waves of Soviet defenders around Kursk, the Eastern Front was collapsing in an entirely different direction. The trap that had seemed so promising when Operation Citadel began on the 5th of July was rapidly becoming a cage of Soviet design rather than German. Hundreds of kilometers away, Soviet forces were breaking through German defenses in sectors that the High Command had fatally stripped of reserves to fuel the Kursk offensive. What the German planners had not fully grasped was that the Soviet Union was no longer a reactive force waiting to be struck. They had become masters of the offensive themselves, and they were about to teach Germany an expensive lesson about fighting a war on multiple fronts with diminishing resources. In the weeks leading up to Kursk, the Soviet High Command had prepared not one operation but three. While the Germans concentrated everything on the salient, Soviet forces in other sectors of the front had been quietly mobilizing. The 10th Guards Army, the 63rd Army, and multiple armored corps had been massing in regions that German intelligence assessed as relatively quiet. To the north, around the town of Orel, Soviet forces assembled for Operation Kutuzov, named after the Russian general who had defeated Napoleon. To the south, armies positioned themselves for Operation Polkovodets Suvorov, another reference to a storied Russian commander. These were not improvised responses to German action. They were planned operations, researched, coordinated, and timed with ruthless precision to strike while German strength was concentrated elsewhere. The logic was pitiless and simple. Germany could not defend every sector with equal strength. If Soviet forces attacked the German positions around Orel, at the same moment that the Leibstandarte and their comrades were grinding through the defensive belts near Kursk, the Germans would face an impossible choice. They could reinforce the Kursk offensive and risk catastrophic breakthrough in the north. Or they could divert reserves northward and watch their prospects for breaking through at Kursk evaporate. Either way, the Soviets would have strategic victory. It was the essence of the maneuver that German theorists called the Schwerpunkt, the concentration of force at the decisive point, but turned against its originators. The Soviet forces around Orel comprised more than 500,000 men, tanks that had arrived in months of uninterrupted production, and artillery reserves so vast that German officers found the numbers almost incomprehensible when intelligence reports began filtering through. The assault on German positions north of Orel commenced on the 12th of July, just a week after the Leibstandarte had crossed the line of departure near Kursk. Soviet artillery opened the assault with a bombardment of such intensity that German survivors reported that the ground itself seemed to be moving, undulating beneath their positions like ocean waves. Within hours, Soviet infantry poured through the gaps in the German line. The defenders, mostly second-rate German divisions and Hungarian allies, were overwhelmed. By the 14th of July, Soviet forces had advanced nearly 40 kilometers into German-held territory. What had been a quiet sector of the front was transforming into a major breakthrough. Messages began arriving at Army Group Center headquarters with increasingly urgent language. The situation north of Orel was becoming critical. Reserves were needed immediately. At the same time, far to the south, Soviet forces were executing Operation Polkovodets Suvorov with equal violence and precision. In the Belgorod region, where the Leibstandarte's sister formations of the 4th Panzer Army pushed toward Kursk, German forces suddenly found themselves under assault from the rear and flank. Soviet armies pushed west and southwest, driving deep into territory that German planners had assumed would remain stable throughout the operation. The German 8th Army, which was supposed to be supporting the southern thrust toward Kursk, was being drawn into defensive battles just to protect its own flanks. Officers began requesting additional divisions. Panzer reinforcements that had been earmarked for the drive into the Kursk salient were being diverted to stem new breakthroughs. The High Command faced a hemorrhage of reserves, and the flow was accelerating. Field Marshal Manstein, commanding Army Group South, was among the first to grasp the strategic catastrophe unfolding. He had been supremely confident that breakthrough at Kursk was achievable if only given enough time and resources. Now those resources were being vacuumed away toward crises that were developing faster than reserves could be positioned to meet them. Manstein sent urgent requests to Hitler and the High Command, begging for additional divisions to be released from the reserves that had been held back as insurance. But those divisions were not idle reserves kept in safe rear areas. Many were already committed to other sectors. Others were being held by Hitler himself, who had grown obsessed with maintaining security in other regions and was reluctant to strip anywhere else to reinforce operations he had already grown doubtful about. The window for breakthrough that had seemed so promising on the 5th of July was closing by the hour. The mathematics of attrition were working against the Germans with brutal logic. The Leibstandarte and the elite formations around Kursk were suffering heavy losses while making steady but grinding progress against the Soviet defenses. The casualties were mounting into thousands per day among the assault units. Tank losses were equally severe. Panzers and assault guns that had been pressed into action were being lost faster than the damaged ones could be repaired and returned to service. Meanwhile, units that should have been following up the breakthrough were being siphoned off to deal with Soviet breakthroughs elsewhere. Every crisis in another sector of the front meant fewer troops available to exploit any gap the Leibstandarte might create. And the Soviets, understanding that they did not need to defeat the Germans at Kursk so much as simply prevent breakthrough while defeating them elsewhere, pressed their advantages in the north and south with relentless focus. By the 16th of July, Hitler's headquarters was receiving reports that left no room for illusion. Soviet forces had advanced nearly 100 kilometers north of Orel. The German position in that entire region was in danger of becoming a salient itself, with the possibility of encirclement and catastrophic loss. German units north of Kursk were reporting that they were being pressed back. The momentum of the offensive south of Kursk was slowing visibly as reserves were withheld and existing formations were weakened to maintain positions elsewhere. Hitler, who had never been comfortable with Operation Citadel to begin with, finally made his decision. The offensive around Kursk would be halted. Reserves would be diverted to contain the Soviet breakthroughs in other sectors. The operation that had been promised as the crushing blow to Soviet power, the moment when German military superiority would reassert itself over Soviet numerical advantage, was being suspended. The order to halt came as both relief and bitter disappointment to frontline commanders. The Leibstandarte and other formations had been pushing forward with casualties mounting and success measured in kilometers purchased with blood. There was a school of thought among officers who believed that one more day of effort, one more concentrated push of reserves and firepower might achieve the breakthrough that would unravel Soviet defenses and transform the entire situation. The High Command understood, finally, that they could not afford to spend more resources on Kursk when the entire front was fragmenting. The halt order came through around the middle of July, and the Leibstandarte received new instructions. Instead of driving forward, they were to secure their positions against Soviet counterattacks and begin planning for withdrawal. The withdrawal itself became a masterclass in tactical competence and strategic futility. The Leibstandarte and other German formations conducted fighting retreats, establishing rearguard positions and inflicting heavy losses on Soviet pursuing forces. There was no chaos, no panic. German professionalism and training still showed in the orderly way positions were established and held, while other units fell back. But the rearguard actions were fundamentally different from the breakthrough attempts that had preceded them. Then, the Leibstandarte had been attacking into prepared defences, knowing that reserves were available if needed. Now they were retreating against an enemy that was constantly probing for weakness, trying to turn flanks and encircle isolated groups. The fighting was just as intense but driven by the opposite imperative. The goal now was not to gain ground but to give it up as slowly and expensively as possible while protecting the withdrawal of units behind them. As the Leibstandarte fell back from the positions they had occupied south of Kursk, the scale of the Soviet victory became increasingly apparent. The operations in the north and south were not merely localized successes. They represented a fundamental shift in the balance of forces on the Eastern Front. German strategic reserves were being committed piecemeal to contain breakthroughs, rather than being held in hand for exploitation of the next opportunity. The Leibstandarte, which had symbolized the offensive power of the German war machine, was now engaged in the harder and less glorious work of protecting the withdrawal. Tank companies that had spearheaded advances were now used to delay Soviet columns. Motorized infantry that had been trained for swift assault were now holding defensive lines. The elite were being reduced to firefighters, responding to crises rather than creating them. The fundamental tragedy was that from a tactical perspective, the Leibstandarte had performed well at Kursk. Their advance had been steady. Casualties, though heavy, had been inflicted at worse ratios on the Soviet defenders. The tactical victories were real. Terrain had been taken. Enemy forces had been pushed back. But all of it had been irrelevant to the larger truth that the war was being decided elsewhere, in the sectors where Soviet forces were breaking through German lines and driving deep into occupied territory. A tactical victory at Kursk meant nothing if the strategic situation around Orel and Belgorod was collapsing. The Soviet strategy had worked precisely as intended. They had absorbed the German blow at the point where it was strongest, and meanwhile delivered crushing defeats at points where Germany was weak. By the time German commanders fully understood what was happening, the damage was already done. The halt of Operation Citadel and the beginning of the Leibstandarte's withdrawal marked the end of something profound in German military history. It was the moment when Germany finally accepted that it could no longer conduct major offensive operations on the Eastern Front. The illusions that had persisted through the winter of 1942, the hopes kindled by the Kharkov victory in spring of 1943, the confidence expressed in the planning documents for Operation Citadel, all of it evaporated in the face of Soviet breakthroughs in sectors that German planners had judged secondary. The Soviet pincers had not needed to actually close around German formations to achieve their purpose. Simply opening up crises elsewhere had been sufficient to force the Germans to abandon their main effort. It was a lesson in modern warfare that the Germans were only now, too late, beginning to understand. You could not win by concentrating superior force at one point if your enemy could distribute inferior force across multiple points and threaten you everywhere at once. The Red Army had learned what the Wehrmacht was only beginning to grasp as the Leibstandarte pulled back from Kursk. The future, and it was a future that would belong entirely to the Soviet Union, belonged to forces that could handle multiple simultaneous operations, sustain massive casualties, and replenish losses with seemingly inexhaustible resources. The temperatures on the steppe had begun to climb again, but on the Leibstandarte command posts along the salient, a different kind of heat was mounting. By the 13th of July 1943, more than a week into Operation Citadel, the mathematics of the offensive had shifted against the Germans in ways that no amount of tactical brilliance could reverse. The Leibstandarte had advanced perhaps 40 to 50 kilometers into the Soviet positions south of Kursk, but every kilometer had been purchased with tank losses and infantry casualties that the German replacement system could not sustain. The defensive belts that intelligence had promised would crumble within 2 or 3 days of assault remained stubbornly intact, layer after layer, each one reinforced with reserves the Soviets seemed to produce from inexhaustible wells. Urgent signals from Army Group South headquarters spoke of deteriorating situations to the north and west, far beyond the immediate tactical concerns of the Kursk salient itself. The breakthrough that had seemed possible on the 5th of July now appeared as a fading mirage, and the men commanding the Leibstandarte could feel the subtle shift in the tone of orders arriving from above, a shift from aggression toward caution, from vision toward doubt. What had changed was not the enemy ahead, but the enemy elsewhere. Soviet operations in other sectors of the Eastern Front, particularly Operation Kutuzov, which had commenced on the 12th of July to the north and west, were beginning to crack open the German position across a far wider front than the Kursk salient itself. The Leibstandarte did not need detailed situation maps to understand that they were no longer part of an overwhelming offensive thrust, but had instead become a sideshow, a secondary focus of effort in a theater where Soviet initiative had transformed from defensive to aggressively expansive. Field Marshal Manstein, the architect of the Kursk operation and a man of considerable strategic vision, recognized that the broader situation demanded a halt to the southern offensive to free up reserves for more desperate needs elsewhere. The decision, when it came, was not dramatic or accompanied by inspiring speeches. It arrived in the form of quiet orders to cease the forward advance and to begin consolidating positions, a command that transformed the Leibstandarte from attacking force into static defender almost overnight. For soldiers trained and psychologically prepared for breakthrough, for officers whose doctrine and mentality centered on movement and exploitation, the halt was more than a tactical adjustment. It was a wound to the soldiers' spirit, a silent acknowledgement that the war had turned in a direction from which it could not be turned back. The Soviet forces, however, had no intention of allowing the Germans the luxury of static defense. Even as the Leibstandarte prepared to dig in and hold their gains, Soviet reserves were flowing toward the front, and reconnaissance reports began detailing massing formations to the south and east. The Soviets had endured the German assault and maintained their reserves specifically for this moment, understanding that the German offensive, once launched, would exhaust itself in the struggle against prepared defenses. Now came the exploitation phase, where the Germans had hoped to pour through breakthrough sectors and envelop Soviet forces in a grand encirclement. The Soviets instead began executing their own envelopment against the German spearhead itself. The Leibstandarte faced not only an immediate threat from their front, but from the prospect of their flank becoming exposed and their lines of supply and retreat becoming threatened by converging Soviet offensives. The transition from attacker to defender happened with startling speed, and the defensive positions the Leibstandarte began to occupy were not prepared fortifications, but hastily selected terrain where they would need to stand and fight without the luxury of fortification or depth of position behind them. The order to withdraw, when it came, was initially reluctant and contested. Some German commanders, including certain echelons within Army Group South, still harbored hopes that a renewed effort, properly supported with additional reserves and fresh formations, might yet achieve the breakthrough that continued to elude them. The Leibstandarte received orders to hold their current positions and prepare for resumption of the offensive, orders that implied counter-offensives might be launched to relieve pressure mounting against German flanks elsewhere. But the situation on those flanks continued to deteriorate with alarming rapidity. Soviet forces were moving rapidly through territory that German High Command had assumed would be secured by earlier German operations, and the threat of encirclement grew from theoretical possibility to increasingly concrete danger. By around the 15th of July, it became clear to even the most optimistic commanders that remaining in place meant eventual isolation and destruction. The order came to disengage and fall back, initially to maintain contact with German forces to the south and west that were coming under ever greater pressure. What had been a drive forward became a fighting retreat, and the Leibstandarte, like other German formations, began a withdrawal that would eventually extend hundreds of kilometers across the steppe. Fighting withdrawals are among the most difficult maneuvers in warfare, requiring precise coordination between rearguard units that hold positions to cover the retreat of the main force, and those main forces pulling back in intervals to new defensive lines. The Leibstandarte, for all its training and discipline, now faced the bitter mathematics of rearguard operations, where the enemy was no longer something to overcome, but something to evade. The Soviet forces, sensing German withdrawal, did not simply allow it to proceed unmolested. Soviet mechanized and cavalry formations probed forward, seeking to catch German columns in the open, to disrupt withdrawal routes, and to inflict maximum casualty as the Germans fell back. Tank and anti-tank gun duels erupted with increasing frequency as the Leibstandarte companies and platoons engaged Soviet advance guards to buy time for the main body to move. The men who had advanced with such confidence and ferocity a week earlier now found themselves running, consolidating on new lines, only to be forced from those lines after brief hours of defense. The momentum of warfare, that intoxicating sensation of forward motion and expanding possibilities, had reversed, and now every order from above spoke of holding longer, falling back further, and managing the transition from victor to fugitive in the space of hours or days. The supply lines that had seemed adequate for an offensive began to stretch to the breaking point under withdrawal conditions. Vehicles that had been arranged to bring fuel and ammunition forward now needed to be redirected to move wounded, equipment, and personnel rearward. The Leibstandarte's mobile maintenance units and repair facilities, which had operated close to the front to support offensive operations, now became vulnerable to Soviet air attack and ground action, forcing their evacuation under pressure. Fuel shortages began to bite deeper as vehicles that could not be refueled were abandoned, and the organic mobility that had been one of the division's greatest advantages became increasingly compromised. Men marched on foot alongside motorized columns that moved by fits and starts as the availability of gasoline dictated. The coherence of the unit began to fray at the edges, not due to any failure of discipline, but simply because the logistics system supporting the Leibstandarte was straining to the point where it could no longer maintain the tight organization and coordination that characterized the division during better times. Officers found themselves managing smaller and smaller pockets of men, and the grand mechanized formation that had advanced against the Soviet lines was dispersing into a more ragged collection of rearguards, reserves, and fragmented companies holding temporary positions. The psychological impact of withdrawal struck soldiers and officers alike in different ways. Some men, particularly those who had survived the previous winter campaign of 1941 to 1942, recognized the pattern and understood that they were witnessing the beginning of another long retreat. Others, particularly younger soldiers who had joined the Leibstandarte after earlier campaigns and who had been imbued with an ideology of German superiority and inevitable victory, struggled to process the reality that the offensive had failed and that they were now running rather than advancing. Officers worked to maintain morale even as the situation deteriorated, issuing orders for orderly withdrawal and praising the discipline with which units disengaged and fell back. But everyone understood that something fundamental had shifted. The Leibstandarte had been recruited, trained, and indoctrinated with the expectation that they would be the instrument of German victory, that their fanaticism and superiority would overcome any obstacle. Now they faced the possibility that fanaticism and superiority were insufficient against enemies with greater resources, deeper manpower pools, and an increasingly coherent strategic vision. The cognitive dissonance was profound, and it worked slowly through the ranks like poison through a body, creating fractures in confidence that no propaganda or exhortation could entirely seal. The Soviet forces continued to press the withdrawal, not with the coordinated precision of the German mechanized formations, but with overwhelming numbers and relentless momentum. Soviet cavalry and mechanized corps, supported by numerous tank formations, maintained contact with the retreating Germans and continually probed for opportunities to cut off or encircle German units. The Leibstandarte's anti-tank defenses, which had been so effective in stopping Soviet breakthrough attempts during the offensive phase, became the mechanism through which German formations held together during retreat. Tank hunter detachments, working in concert with remaining tank platoons and anti-tank gun crews, set up positions on successive ridges and defensive lines, holding just long enough for the main body to escape, before themselves withdrawing under cover of darkness, or when Soviet pressure became overwhelming. Losses continued to mount, not in the spectacular explosions of tank engagements during the breakthrough phase, but in the grinding attrition of daily contact with a pursuing enemy. Men fell to sniper fire in the withdrawing columns. Vehicles broke down and had to be destroyed to prevent capture. Stragglers fell behind and became separated from their units, facing the choice between attempting to find their way back to German lines or surrendering to Soviet forces. The transformation from disciplined, organized formation to desperate, fragmented remnant accelerated with each day that the withdrawal continued. Around the 20th of July, more than a week into the withdrawal from Kursk, the Leibstandarte crossed back over the starting positions from which they had launched the offensive. The ground they had won at such cost in blood and material resources was surrendered without formal ceremony or acknowledgement beyond the simple necessity of continuing to move backward. The steppe that had seemed open to endless German exploitation now felt constricted, threatening, and every horizon held the possibility of Soviet formations attempting to encircle or cut off the Leibstandarte and other German units. The morale reports that began appearing in war diaries and situation summaries from divisional headquarters spoke of units maintaining discipline but expressing deep concern about the possibility of breakthrough operations resuming with adequate reserves and support. Yet everyone understood that no resumption would occur. The industrial capacity that might have produced new tanks, new vehicles, and new ammunition was already being overtaxed by multiple theatres of war. The manpower that could have replaced fallen soldiers was not available in sufficient quantities. The Leibstandarte could maintain its cohesion as a fighting force, but it could no longer maintain its position as an offensive spearhead or breakthrough force. The unit was being permanently transformed from the instrument of German blitzkrieg into something else entirely, something reactive and fundamentally defensive. By the end of July, the Leibstandarte had established defensive positions several dozen kilometers south of Kursk, positions that remained precarious and subject to continued Soviet pressure. The grand operation that was supposed to secure the German position in the east and reverse the momentum of the war had instead become one more episode in a progressive series of retreats and stoppages that stretched back to the failure before Moscow in 1941. The Leibstandarte did not lack the capability to inflict heavy casualties on Soviet forces that attacked their positions or the discipline to maintain effective defense. What they lacked was any strategic situation into which their tactical success could be translated into operational advantage. They were expert fighters in a war that Germany could no longer win, and their expertise could extend the war but not change its fundamental direction. The withdrawal from Kursk marked not a single moment of German defeat, but rather the crystallization of a reality that had been slowly becoming apparent since the summer of 1942. From this point forward, the Leibstandarte would fight to defend terrain rather than to seize it, to inflict casualties rather than to achieve breakthrough, and to delay Soviet advance rather than to exploit German success. The war that had seemed winnable in 1941 was becoming, in 1943, a war of managing inevitable decline. When the guns finally fell silent across the Kursk salient in the middle of July 1943, the German High Command faced a truth that no amount of strategic rhetoric could disguise. The operation that was meant to restore German dominance in the East had instead revealed the exact inverse, the moment when German military power began its irreversible descent. The Leibstandarte and their sister divisions had fought with courage and tactical competence that, in earlier years, would have sufficed to achieve breakthrough and victory. Yet tactical excellence had encountered something larger than itself, something that no training could overcome and no fanaticism could circumvent. The Kursk offensive did not fail because German soldiers were inadequate, or because German officers lacked imagination, or even because Soviet soldiers possessed superior courage. It failed because the Soviet Union, through ruthless mobilization and industrial capacity that Germany could never match, had created conditions where tactical brilliance mattered less than strategic depth, where elite units bumped against layers of prepared defense that stretched beyond the horizon, and where every advance extracted a price that German manpower reserves could not sustain indefinitely. The first and most immediate lesson was deceptive in its simplicity. The Soviets had known what was coming. Through intelligence networks, human assets, and systematic analysis, Moscow understood German intentions weeks before the panzers rolled forward. This knowledge transformed the battlefield from a space where surprise and maneuver might have shifted the balance into a stage where Germany confronted exactly the conditions its military doctrine was least equipped to handle. Soviet commanders had constructed not one defensive line, but multiple successive belts of fortification, each deeper than the last, each prepared with thousands of anti-tank guns positioned to create killing zones that no breakthrough could avoid. The Leibstandarte had trained to achieve rapid penetration, to exploit success, to operate in fluid and mobile warfare where their superior training and cohesion provided advantage. Instead, they encountered the nightmare scenario, static defense in depth, with unlimited reserves flowing into the breach. Every kilometer cost casualties that could not be replaced. Every day of delay meant more Soviet reinforcements arriving, and every tactical success proved strategically hollow because the operational objective receded further and further away. The mathematics of Kursk revealed a stark asymmetry that German planning had fundamentally miscalculated. The Soviet Union could absorb casualties at rates that would have crippled any other military power. They possessed reserve armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, positioned behind the front in echelon formations, ready to feed into the battle as losses demanded. German casualties, by contrast, came from a population already squeezed by warfare on multiple fronts, already depleted by 3 years of continuous combat in the Soviet Union. The Leibstandarte exemplified this trap. A division that had begun the war with some 18,000 personnel now fought with strength far below establishment, unable to draw adequate replacements, its losses permanent rather than temporary. For every tank the Leibstandarte lost to Soviet anti-tank guns or aircraft, German industry could manufacture replacement, but not quickly enough and never in sufficient numbers. Soviet armor production, accelerated by factories relocated beyond German bombing range, churned out tanks at rates that made attrition warfare inherently favorable to Moscow. The Germans entered Kursk assuming they could trade space and time for victory. They discovered instead that space and time belonged to the Soviets, and every kilometer conquered meant another kilometer away from German supply lines, and another kilometer deeper into a landscape that would consume German strength through endless exchange. The defensive superiority that the Soviets had achieved by mid-1943 marked a revolutionary shift in military capability on the Eastern Front. The days of blitzkrieg, when German armor and motor transport could slice through defending armies and spread chaos across operational depth, belonged to history. Soviet anti-tank tactics had matured from desperate improvisation into sophisticated doctrine. Guns positioned in interlocking fields of fire, armor reserves positioned to strike at exposed flanks, infantry prepared to counterattack breakthroughs before they could expand. The Kursk salient provided the Soviets a perfect opportunity to demonstrate this new mastery. German attacks came from predictable directions against known prepared positions. Soviet defenders possessed unlimited time to position artillery, to dig trenches, to mine approaches, to prepare alternate positions. The Leibstandarte's assault groups discovered that charges into prepared defenses, even conducted with perfect tactical coordination and overlapping firepower, faced casualty rates that made the attacker the effective casualty, not the defender. This inversion, where the attacker suffered proportionally higher losses than the defender, represented a fundamental shift in warfare. It meant that offensive operations could no longer guarantee success, that breakthrough required overwhelming superiority that Germany no longer possessed, and that future operations would face similar conditions, defending Soviets with superior positions, superior numbers, and superior willingness to absorb losses. The failure at Kursk also exposed the fracture lines within German military leadership that had been widening throughout 1943. Field Marshal Manstein had advocated for the operation with genuine confidence that breakthrough was achievable, that the Leibstandarte and other elite panzer divisions possessed sufficient combat power to accomplish the objective before Soviet reserves could fully mobilize. He was wrong, and more importantly, the operational assumptions underlying his confidence were exposed as outdated. Army Group South had possessed overwhelming local superiority in armor and aircraft when Operation Citadel began. Yet this superiority proved insufficient against prepared defenses and steady Soviet reinforcement. For the first time, German local superiority no longer translated into operational breakthrough. This lesson cascaded through the German command structure, permeating down to divisional and regimental commanders, who began to understand that prior calculations of force ratio and superiority had lost meaning against an enemy who could always feed more forces into the cauldron. Hitler, never convinced of the operation's necessity, found in the failure confirmation of his pessimism about the entire Eastern Front strategy. The mutual recriminations that followed between Hitler and his field marshals reflected this deeper crisis. Senior commanders possessed no coherent vision for winning a war that the Soviet Union seemed determined to win through unlimited mobilization and willingness to accept casualties that haunted German officers. Yet Kursk proved something even more fundamental about the structural conditions facing Germany by mid-1943. Industrial capacity, raw materials, manpower reserves, and the capacity to sustain operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. All these advantages belonged to the Soviet Union, and increasingly to the Anglo-American powers mobilizing across the Atlantic and Pacific. Germany entered 1943, already committed to defense on multiple fronts. The Soviet Union consuming manpower and resources at rates that no German economic system could sustain. North Africa and Mediterranean, requiring increasingly desperate reinforcements. The Atlantic and European coasts preparing for invasion that German resources could not fully prepare against. The Leibstandarte and their sister divisions fought magnificently at Kursk, but they fought as expressions of a state apparatus that was slowly running out of everything that warfare demands: men, machines, fuel, time, and national will. Every casualty suffered by the Leibstandarte represented an irreplaceable loss to German offensive capability. Every tank destroyed represented